Hello there and welcome to Life Beyond Scene, where curiosity slows down, history speaks quietly, and strange stories are allowed to unfold without hurry. Tonight we're heading far out into the Atlantic, beyond the noise of towns, beyond the safe glow of windows, and beyond the ordinary comforts of roads, footsteps, and familiar voices. We are going to a small group of Scottish islands where the wind rarely rests, where the sea has the final word in most conversations, and where, more than a century ago, 3 men vanished from a lighthouse without leaving behind a clear answer. The place is called the Flannan Isles. Even the name has a distant sound to it, as if it belongs to a map kept in the back of an old drawer. The lighthouse stood on Eilean Mor, the largest of the islands, though large is a generous word when the Atlantic is all around you. It was not a place made for crowds or comfort. It was rock, grass, cliffs, seabirds, weather, and water. A place where every arrival depended on the mood of the sea, and every departure required permission from waves that were not known for being polite. And at the centre of this story stood a lighthouse, a strong tower built to do one simple, important thing: send out a light, again and again, night after night. Not for beauty, not for decoration, but to warn ships away from danger. That was the work. That was the promise. When darkness came down over the water, the light was meant to be there, steady and reliable, a bright signal in a place where everything else could shift in minutes. There is something deeply comforting about a lighthouse, isn't there? Even if you have never worked in one or lived beside one or sailed by one in rough weather, the idea of it feels clear. A lighthouse is a message from land to sea. It says someone has thought about you. Someone has prepared for the night. Someone has climbed the stairs, checked the lamp, trimmed what needs trimming, polished what needs polishing, and made sure that a stranger out in the dark has a chance of finding their way. But the Flannan Isles lighthouse became famous not because its light shone, but because one night it did not. In December of 1900, a passing ship noticed that the light was out. This was not a small detail. A lighthouse without a light is like a clock without hands, or a doorbell that rings inside an empty house. It is built for one purpose, and when that purpose fails, people begin to wonder why. But this was a remote place, and the weather was poor, and communication did not move with the speed we expect now. There were no quick phone calls to the lighthouse keepers, no message sent to a pocket, no camera feed to check, no simple way to ask, "Is everything all right up there?" So the darkness waited. The men assigned to the station were James Ducat, Thomas Marshall, and Donald MacArthur. 3 lighthouse keepers, 3 working men, 3 people with families, habits, opinions, tired hands, and ordinary worries. It is easy, when a story becomes a mystery, for the people at its centre to turn into figures in a legend. Their names are repeated, their disappearance is examined, and over time they can begin to feel less like real men and more like pieces on a board. But before anything strange happened, they were simply doing a demanding job in a difficult place. They had duties, they had routines, they had meals to prepare, instruments to check, weather to record, equipment to maintain, and a light to keep alive. Lighthouse work could be lonely, but it was not idle. There were stairs to climb, glass to clean, oil and machinery to manage, logs to write, and the endless presence of weather pressing against every wall. The sea did not allow a person to forget where they were. It shook the windows, it struck the rocks below. It threw spray high enough to remind even the most experienced keeper that the island was not really still. It only looked that way between storms. Now, before we walk farther into this quiet mystery, I want you to settle in wherever you are. Maybe you're listening late at night, with the room dim and the rest of the house asleep. Maybe you're somewhere warm, far from the Atlantic, with no sound of gulls or wind against stone. Maybe rain is tapping at your window. Maybe everything around you is still. Wherever you are, take a moment to notice the nearest light. A lamp beside you, a phone screen, a small glow from the hallway, or the soft edge of the moonlight on a curtain. Imagine how different that light would feel if you were miles from shore in cold weather, watching for one beam from a tower on a black island. And if you feel like sharing, where are you listening from tonight? Are you near the sea or far inland? Have you ever seen a lighthouse in person, not just in a photograph, but standing there against the weather, doing its patient work? There is something about these questions that fits this story, because the Flannan Isles mystery is not only about what may have happened to three men, it is also about distance, the distance between shore and island, between signal and silence, between fact and rumour, between the last ordinary moment and the first sign that something has gone wrong. If this kind of calm journey into history, mystery, and the quieter corners of the world helps you unwind, I would be grateful if you liked the video and subscribed. It helps this little corner of stillness reach more people who enjoy strange stories told gently, without shouting, without rushing, and without turning every shadow into a monster. There will be mystery tonight. Yes, there will be unanswered questions. But there will also be care, context, and a steady walk through the details, because some stories become more interesting when we stop trying to force them into something louder than they are. The disappearance at the Flannan Isles lighthouse has often been told with dramatic flourishes. Over the years, people have added strange logbook entries, wild storms, untouched meals, frightened birds, supernatural warnings, sea monsters, secret visitors, and all sorts of details that make the tale sound as if it belongs beside a fireplace on a winter night. Some of those details are part of the popular legend, but not all of them belong to the solid record. And that matters, because the real story is already strange enough without dressing it in a borrowed coat and giving it a lantern. At its plainest, the mystery is this. A lighthouse on a remote island was found empty. The three men who should have been there were gone. No bodies were found. No final message explained everything. Some signs suggested that the men had gone outside. Some damage suggested that the sea had been unusually violent around part of the island. The official explanation pointed toward a sudden wave, a dangerous accident, and the kind of weather that can turn a normal task into a fatal mistake. That may be the most reasonable answer. It may also be the closest thing to an answer we will ever have. But reason does not always quiet the mind completely, especially not here, because the setting does so much work on our imagination. A lighthouse is meant to be watched. A lighthouse keeper is meant to keep order in an exposed place. There are rules, routines, records, and responsibilities. So when three keepers disappear together from such a station, our thoughts begin to circle the facts. Why would all three leave the building? What were they doing outside? Did one man get into trouble first and the others go after him? Was there enough warning? Could a wave really have reached them? Did the island itself give them any chance at all? Those questions have kept the story alive for more than 100 years. Part of the reason is that the Flannan Isles sit in a kind of natural stage for mystery. They are remote, but not imaginary. Dangerous, but not impossible to reach. Harsh, but not empty of human purpose. Before the lighthouse, the islands had long carried an air of isolation. There were old associations with saints, ruins, grazing sheep, and passing fishermen. People knew of the place, but very few had reason to stay there. It was not a village. It was not a harbour town. It was not somewhere a person casually wandered through on the way to somewhere else. You went there because work required it, or weather allowed it, or because the sea for a short time decided not to stop you. That is important to remember. The isolation was practical, not decorative. The men at the lighthouse did not simply feel cut off in some romantic sense. They were cut off in a daily, physical, working sense. If something happened, help was not across the street. If weather worsened, a planned visit could be delayed. If the light failed, the first people to notice might be on a ship already passing by in rough conditions. The modern mind is used to instant contact, so it can be hard to sit with the slowness of 1900. But this story asks us to sit with it. A light goes out. A report travels. A relief vessel is delayed. Days pass. The island remains where it is, holding whatever has happened. Imagine the lighthouse in that waiting period, not as a haunted place, not yet, but as a working station suddenly without workers. The tower still standing, the rooms still there, the equipment still holding the shape of the use, the wind still moving around the walls, the sea still rising and falling below. If the men were already gone, then the building had entered a strange kind of pause. Everything made by human hands remained, but the human voices had disappeared from it. There is a difference between an abandoned place and an interrupted one. An abandoned place slowly becomes empty. Dust gathers, doors loosen, grass grows in paths, and time takes possession by inches. But an interrupted place feels different. A chair still sits where someone left it. A coat still hangs where a hand placed it. A tool remains close to the task it was meant for. The mind sees these things and supplies the missing person. It says he was just here. He meant to come back. He had not finished. That is why lighthouse mysteries hold us so firmly. They combine order and exposure. Inside there are walls, lamps, logs, clocks, beds, tables, and rules. Outside there is weather, height, darkness, and water deep enough to remove evidence without effort. A lighthouse keeper lives between the two. He belongs to the room and the storm at the same time. He is a householder, mechanic, watchman, weather observer, and servant of strangers he may never meet. He keeps danger at a distance for other people, while standing very close to it himself. The Flannan Isles case also arrived at a time when the world was modern enough to expect systems, but not modern enough to guarantee answers. The lighthouse itself represented engineering and order. It was built to make the sea safer. It belonged to an age of schedules, navigation, official reports, and expanding technology. Yet around it remained the older reality of the Atlantic, which did not care much for paperwork. You could build a tower, install a lamp, assign trained men, and create procedures. Still, one sudden sea could turn all of that into a question. That contrast is one of the reasons the story still works on the imagination. It is not simply 3 men disappeared. Sadly, people have disappeared in many places and in many ways. It is that they disappeared from a place designed around vigilance. Their job was to watch, to record, to maintain, to keep the light going, and then, at some point, the watchers were gone. For tonight we will take our time with it. We will not rush straight to the most dramatic version. We will not begin by assuming ghosts, monsters, madness, or murder. We will start with the place, because places matter. Then we will spend time with the men, because names matter. After that, we will follow the sequence as carefully as we can, from the first report of darkness, to the delayed relief voyage, to the arrival at the island, to the unsettling discovery inside the lighthouse. Later, we will look at the damage outside, the official investigation, the most likely explanation, and the legends that grew around the empty tower like sea mist around rock. And through all of it, we will keep one simple idea close. A mystery does not have to be exaggerated to be worth telling. Sometimes the quiet version is the most powerful one. 3 men went to work in a lonely place, a light failed, a ship arrived. The lighthouse was empty. That is enough to make the room feel still. So, settle in. Let your shoulders loosen a little. Let the day move farther away. Picture a black stretch of sea west of Scotland at the turn of the 20th century. Picture a vessel making its way through cold water. Picture the shape of an island ahead, hard and dark against the winter sky. Somewhere above the cliff stands a tower that should be shining. Sailors look for the beam, expecting it to appear where it always should. But the night remains dark, and on the island, behind stone walls built to resist the weather, 3 places at the station wait for 3 men who do not return. Eilean Mor is not the kind of island that gently introduces itself. It does not greet visitors with a harbour full of boats, a row of cottages, a shop window, or a road leading somewhere warm. It rises from the Atlantic as a hard piece of land, small enough to seem fragile on a map, but large enough, when you're standing on it, to feel like a world of its own. The name means Big Island, which is fair enough if you compare it to the smaller rocks around it, though the Atlantic may have its own opinion on the matter. Beside that much water, even the biggest island can look like a stone left on a table. The Flannan Isles sit west of the Isle of Lewis, out where the weather has plenty of room to gather itself before arriving. From a distance, they do not look like a place designed for human comfort. They look more like a place that tolerates human visits for short periods, provided everyone behaves sensibly and leaves before conditions become awkward. Eilean Mor is the largest of them, and it became the chosen site for the lighthouse because it gave the light height, visibility, and a clear warning to ships moving through dangerous waters. Practical reasons, in other words. Lighthouses are not built in convenient places. They are built where they are needed, which usually means somewhere inconvenient enough to make every builder, keeper, and supply crew think carefully about their life choices. To understand the disappearance at the Flannan Isles, it helps to spend time with the island before we spend more time with the mystery. Because Eilean Mor was not just a background. It shaped everything. It shaped how the lighthouse was built, how the keepers worked, how supplies arrived, how dangerous ordinary tasks could become, and why a simple question like, "What happened?" could remain unanswered for so long. On a mainland road, if 3 men vanish from a building, people search the nearby streets, speak to neighbours, check stations, fields, inns and houses. On Eilean Mor, the search began with rock, cliffs, grass, a landing place, and the sea. There were not many directions a man could go. That should make the mystery easier. Strangely, it makes it harder. The island itself was exposed from every side. The sea did not approach politely from one direction. It surrounded the place completely, striking different parts of the shore depending on wind, tide, and season. Some days, the water might allow a landing. Other days, it could turn the edge of the island into a moving wall of spray and force. A boat could come close and still be unable to put men safely ashore. That is one of the details modern listeners sometimes forget. We hear that a relief vessel was delayed, and it sounds like a small scheduling problem, the sort of thing caused by paperwork or someone misplacing a key. But in a place like the Flannans, delay could mean the sea had closed the door. There were landing places on the island, but a landing place is not the same as a harbour. A harbour offers shelter. A landing place merely says, under certain conditions with skill, caution and luck, you may try here. Men and supplies had to be brought ashore in small boats. Everything needed by the station, food, fuel, tools, personal items, equipment, had to make the journey from vessel to island, then from the shore up toward the lighthouse. The cliffs and slopes made that work slow and physical. The construction of the lighthouse had required serious effort, because materials had to be brought to a site that did not care how heavy they were. Stone, metal, machinery, oil, timber, and all the parts of a working lighthouse had to be moved into position on an island that offered no easy welcome. That is why the human presence on Eilean Mor feels so deliberate. Nothing there happened casually. A person did not simply build a lighthouse because there was a spare afternoon and a pleasant view. The tower represented planning, labour, cost, and endurance. Every wall, stair, rail, path, and store had been placed there against difficulty. The lighthouse was an act of order set down in a place where disorder was normal. The keepers lived inside that order, but they could not escape the land around it. Their world was stone floors, lamps, logs, beds, doors, meals and duties, with cliffs and weather always waiting outside. The island had an older human story too. Long before the lighthouse, Eilean Mor had religious associations connected with St. Flannan. There were old remains on the island, including a small chapel or cell, the kind of ruin that makes a lonely place feel even older than it already is. Such remains do not need dramatic treatment. They are simply there, quiet evidence that people had known this island before the lighthouse keepers, before the official reports, before the famous disappearance. People had come for prayer, shelter, grazing, work, or necessity. The island was remote, but not unknown. It had been visited, named, used, feared, respected, and left again. Still, it was not a settled place in the ordinary sense. There were no permanent families living there when the lighthouse story took place, no village noises, no evening smoke rising from several chimneys, no children running between houses. The keepers were not part of a community on the island. They were the community for the length of their duty. That matters more than it first appears. 3 men in a lighthouse did not have the soft background sounds of ordinary settlement. There were no neighbours to notice if someone seemed troubled, no shopkeeper to remember a conversation, no passerby to say they saw one of the men walking in a certain direction. There was the station, the men, and the weather. A place like Eilean Mor changes the meaning of routine. In a town, routine can feel boring. You walk the same street, pass the same houses, hear the same carts, bells, doors, and voices. On the island, routine was protection. Routine meant that the light was checked. The equipment was cared for, the weather was observed, the meals were made, the station remained orderly. Each repeated task helped hold the day in place. If something broke, it had to be fixed. If something outside needed checking, someone had to go out. If damage appeared at a landing place, it mattered because future supplies and relief depended on it. A loose rope, a damaged box, a broken rail, or a problem near the shore was not a small inconvenience. It could become a serious hazard. The keepers would have known the island through repeated contact. Not in the way a tourist knows a viewpoint after one photograph, but in the practical way working people know a difficult site. They would know which paths became slippery, where the wind struck hardest, where spray could reach, where footing felt safe, and where it only looked safe. They would know the sound of weather changing. They would know how quickly visibility could worsen. They would know that the sea could be dangerous even when a person was not standing at the very edge. Experience does not remove danger. It only teaches you how much respect danger requires. That is one of the unsettling facts behind the Flannan Isles story. The men were not careless visitors wandering about in unsuitable shoes, pointing at seabirds and getting too close to a cliff for a better look. They were lighthouse keepers. Their work required discipline. They understood weather, isolation, and the practical risks of the station. If the sea took them, it did not take men who knew nothing. It took men who knew enough to be cautious. That makes the island feel even more serious. It suggests conditions or circumstances that moved faster than judgment could answer. Eilean Mor's surface was not gentle countryside. It had grass and slopes, but it also had steep drops, rough ground, and cliffs exposed to the Atlantic. The lighthouse stood high, which was useful for the beam, but height also meant distance from the landing places. A keeper who needed to inspect something near the shore had to leave the safety of the station and move across the island. That journey may not sound long in miles, but on a small island in winter weather, distance is measured differently. A few hundred yards can become meaningful when the ground is wet, the wind is strong, and the sea is throwing spray above the rocks. The wind deserves attention because it is almost a character in any lighthouse story, though not a mysterious one. It is practical, constant, and tiring. Wind affects how a person walks, hears, works, and thinks. It can make speech difficult. It can snatch at clothing. It can turn a simple task into a slow negotiation. In strong wind, even standing still takes effort. A man outside in those conditions is not merely going for a stroll. He is managing balance, tools, footing, and the pressure of air moving around him. Add cold and wet clothing, and the body begins to spend energy quickly. Add sea spray, and surfaces become slick. Add urgency, and judgment can narrow to the task immediately in front of you. Then there is the sound. On an island like Eilean Mor, quiet does not always mean silence. The place could be full of noise, but not human noise. Waves striking rock, wind moving around walls, birds calling from ledges, rain hitting windows, the low constant presence of the sea below. Inside the lighthouse, the keepers might hear the weather as a surrounding pressure, something that never fully went away. Even when the light was burning and the station was in order, the island would remind them that the walls were not the world. Outside, everything was moving. This is part of why the Flannan Isles feel so suited to legend. Human beings are good at turning lonely places into story places. When a place is hard to reach and harder to search, the imagination fills the gaps. A remote island does not produce witnesses easily. The sea does not preserve footprints. Wind does not keep statements. If something happens on a cliff in a storm, the evidence may be damaged, scattered, or removed before anyone arrives. That does not mean something supernatural has happened. It means nature has a very efficient way of making investigation difficult. The Atlantic is not required to explain itself afterward. Eilean Mor also sits in a region where weather can change plans without apology. A lighthouse station depended on scheduled relief, but schedules depended on ships, and ships depended on conditions. The men assigned to the island knew that a tour of duty could stretch longer than expected if weather stopped the relief vessel from landing. That uncertainty must have affected the mind in small ways. You could prepare to leave, only to remain. You could expect mail, supplies, and fresh faces, only to have the sea postpone them. Even the comfort of knowing that another crew was coming had to be held lightly. They would come when they could. The island would decide the rest. For the keepers, the view from Eilean Mor may have been both beautiful and severe. In clear weather, the sea would open wide around them, and the Isle of Lewis would lie far away across the water. Birds would move over the cliffs. Light would change across the rocks. The lighthouse tower would stand clean against the sky. A person can imagine moments when the place seemed peaceful, maybe even grand. But remote beauty is still remote. A good view does not cook dinner, warm a bed, or bring help quickly in bad weather. The same cliffs that looked striking in daylight could become threatening when the wind rose and the landing places vanished under spray. The island's isolation was not only physical, it was emotional. The keepers were separated from families and ordinary domestic life. They lived by duty and companionship with the other men on station. In such a place, small habits become important. The time of a meal, the tone of a conversation, the order of work, the reading of a letter, the writing of notes, the checking of instruments. These things build a daily frame around loneliness. Without them, the mind has too much room to wander. That may be why lighthouse keeping required a certain temperament. A keeper needed competence, steadiness, and the ability to live with limited company. He also needed to accept that much of his work mattered most to people he would never see. A ship passing safely because of the Flannan light might never know the names of the men who kept it. That is common in useful work. The better it is done, the less people notice it. A light appears where expected, and the ship continues. No one cheers. No one writes a poem. No one sends a thank you note to the man who climbed the stairs and maintained the lamp. The reward is that nothing happens. No wreck, no alarm, no loss. Safe passage can be very quiet. That quiet usefulness makes the later failure of the light even more striking. The island was remote, the job was demanding, and the men were there precisely so that the light would not fail. When it did, the failure travelled outward as a warning. At first, it was only an observation from a passing vessel. A light that should have been visible was not visible. Such a thing could have technical explanations. Lamps can fail, weather can obscure, reports can be delayed. But the station was not supposed to remain unanswered. So the island held its silence until people could reach it. Before that arrival, before the empty rooms and the questions inside the lighthouse, there is this image of Eilean Mor simply continuing. The island did not react to the disappearance, it did not change its shape. It did not lower its cliffs in apology or calm the water for the search. The grass remained grass, the rocks remained rocks, the sea continued around it. That indifference can feel almost cruel, though it is not cruelty in any human sense. The island had been there before the men arrived and would remain after they were gone. Human events, even terrible ones, are brief beside stone and water. Still, places can hold memory because people give memory to them. Eilean Mor became linked forever with the missing keepers because the facts left room for lasting unease. Had the same accident happened on a busy dock with witnesses and bodies recovered, it would be tragic but not legendary. On this island, the missing details remained open. No final shout was heard by a neighbour. No one watched from a nearby window. No one saw the moment when ordinary work turned into disaster. The island kept that part to itself. There is a temptation to describe Eilean Mor as cursed, haunted or hostile, but that gives the island too much intention. It was not plotting against anyone. It was simply a difficult piece of land in a dangerous sea. That is enough. Not every frightening place needs a ghost. Sometimes bad footing, winter weather, heavy seas, fatigue, and timing can do more than any legend. A wave does not need a motive. A cliff does not need a secret plan. A remote island does not need to be evil in order to be unforgiving. And yet, the human mind still leans towards story. We want the island to mean something because the disappearance feels too abrupt. 3 men were present, and then they were not. The lighthouse had keepers, and then it had none. Somewhere between those two conditions lies the moment we cannot see. Eilean Mor becomes the container for that missing moment. Every slope, rail, path, landing place and broken piece of equipment becomes interesting because one of them may sit near the answer. That is why we spend this time with the island. It prepares us to understand the later clues without rushing them. When we hear that something outside was damaged, we need to remember what outside meant. When we hear that keepers may have gone to inspect a landing, we need to remember that landings were lifelines. When we hear that the sea may have swept men away, we need to remember that this was not a calm beach with a dramatic wave added for effect. This was a high, exposed Atlantic island where water and weather had room to become dangerous. The lighthouse brought human order to Eilean Mor, but it did not tame the place. It only stood there, night after night, doing its work as long as men kept the system alive. The tower was strong, but the men were still flesh and bone. The lamp was bright, but it could not light the next hour before it arrived. The island had paths and rails and landing arrangements, but none of those things turned it into a safe town street. Every practical improvement reduced risk, but did not erase it. So now, with the island in view, the story begins to feel less like a puzzle floating in empty air, and more like an event rooted in a very specific place. Eilean Mor was remote enough to delay help, exposed enough to make routine dangerous, small enough to limit possibilities, and harsh enough to remove evidence. It was a place where 3 men could be doing ordinary work one moment and be beyond reach the next. That is not a satisfying thought, but it is an important one. Picture it for a while. The largest island of the Flannans under a winter sky. The lighthouse standing near the high ground. The old stones of earlier visitors resting lower on the island. The landing places waiting below, useful only when the sea allowed them to be useful. The paths between shore and station. The grass bent by weather. The birds moving in and out of the cliffs. The Atlantic pressing around every side. It is not a place with many hiding places, and yet it became the setting for a disappearance that has hidden its answer for more than a century. This was the world James Ducat, Thomas Marshall, and Donald MacArthur entered when they served at the Flannan Isles Lighthouse. Not a stage built for mystery, but a workplace built against danger. They would have known the tower, the rooms, the routines, and the small practical details of the island far better than any later storyteller. They would have known where the land was awkward, where the wind caught, where the sea struck hardest, and where caution was not optional. They were not separate from Eilean Mor during their duty. They lived inside its weather, its limits, and its demands. And with that lonely island now more clearly before us, we can begin to turn toward the men themselves, not as shadows in a famous mystery, but as working lighthouse keepers with names, responsibilities, experience, and ordinary lives waiting somewhere beyond the water. And before the light went dark, before sailors searched the horizon and found no beam where one should have been, before the Hesperus came near the island and found no welcoming figures at the landing, there were 3 men living and working inside the lighthouse: James Ducat, Thomas Marshall, and Donald MacArthur. Their names are often spoken together now, joined by the mystery that took them, but in life they were not symbols or clues. They were men doing a hard job in a hard place. They had separate lives, separate tempers, separate histories, separate people, waiting for them beyond the water. The mystery made them famous, but the work came first, and it is worth staying with that for a while. James Ducat was the principal lightkeeper. That title matters. It means he was the man with chief responsibility at the station, the one expected to keep the routine steady, to supervise the work, to make sure the light was ready, the records were kept, the equipment was cared for, and the station remained in proper order. He was not new to the lighthouse service. He had entered it as a young man in the late 1870s and had spent years moving through the demanding world of lights, islands, towers, coastal stations, weather, machinery and rules. By the time he came to the Flannan Isles, he was an experienced keeper, not a man learning the work for the first time. He had earned his place through years of service, and the role of principal keeper suggests steadiness, trust, and practical knowledge rather than drama. There is something quietly important about that kind of experience. It does not always produce exciting stories. It does not usually leave behind famous speeches or grand gestures. It leaves behind clean lamps, accurate logs, equipment in order, meals prepared, watches kept, and lights burning when ships need them. A good lighthouse keeper, much like a good railway signalman or a good ship's engineer, is often noticed most when something goes wrong. When everything works, the work disappears into safety. The light flashes, the ship passes, the night continues. No one on board may know the keeper's name, or whether he's tired, cold, worried, or thinking of home. They only know the light is there. Ducat had a wife, Mary, and children. That small fact brings the story down from the cliff and into a house somewhere far from the island, where absence was not an idea but a daily condition. Lighthouse families lived with rhythms shaped by duty. The keeper went away, stayed at a station, returned when relieved, then left again. The family learned the pattern. They knew the waiting. They knew that weather could delay a homecoming. They knew that a planned return was not quite a promise until the man was actually ashore. In the case of Flannan, that ordinary waiting turned into something else, something no family should have to understand. It is easy to picture Ducat as the steady centre of the station, though we should be careful not to invent too much. Records tell us his role and service. They do not tell us exactly how he sounded when he spoke, whether he laughed easily, whether he preferred quiet at meals, whether he was strict in small matters, or whether he had a habit of checking the same latch twice before bed. Yet from his position, we can understand what the others would have expected from him. In a station with 3 men, the principal keeper set the tone. If weather was bad, if something needed repair, if supplies had to be checked, if the lamp demanded attention, his judgment mattered. Thomas Marshall was the assistant lightkeeper. He was younger in the service than Ducat, having entered in the 1890s, and records note that he had previously been a seaman. That detail is useful because it reminds us that he was not a stranger to maritime life. A man who had been at sea would know something of weather, risk, discipline, and the practical demands of working around water. He would know that the sea could look one way and behave another. He would know the importance of equipment, timing, and orders. Lighthouse keeping was different from shipboard work, but it belonged to the same broad world of navigation and danger, the same world of men watching weather because lives depended on it. Marshall is sometimes pulled into the more dramatic versions of the story through claims about strange log entries, unusual fear, or emotional disturbance. Those claims have travelled far in retellings, but the safer approach is to leave them aside unless they can be firmly supported. There is no need to make him into a nervous figure for the story to hold attention. The reliable picture is already enough. He was an assistant keeper at one of the most remote stations in Scotland. He was part of a small crew responsible for a new light on a difficult island. He had been trusted with serious work, and when the station was later found empty, evidence suggested that he, like Duquesne, had dressed for outdoor conditions. That does not prove exactly what happened, but it places him in the practical business of the lighthouse rather than in the fog of legend. Think for a moment about the relationship between a principal keeper and an assistant keeper in a remote station. They had to share space, duties, meals, watches, and long hours of weather. They did not have the luxury of avoiding each other. A disagreement could not be solved by taking a walk through town or visiting a friend across the street. The island was small, the station was smaller still. Cooperation was not just pleasant, it was necessary. Every man had to do his part, and every man had to trust that the others would do theirs. This kind of closeness could be companionable, tiring, ordinary or tense depending on the day, but the work required that it continue. Donald MacArthur was the occasional keeper, serving in place of William Ross, who was absent because of illness. The word occasional can sound casual to modern ears, as if he had only wandered in to help for a while, perhaps after finishing something else. But the role should not be mistaken for idleness or inexperience in the broader sense. An occasional keeper could be called upon when needed, and at Flannan he was part of the three-man duty crew. He had responsibilities. He was one of the men expected to help keep the station functioning. The light did not become less important because one keeper was temporary. MacArthur has also suffered somewhat in the legend. Some retellings lean heavily on suggestions that he had a rough temper or a difficult past, using that to feed theories of violence or conflict. This is a common habit in mysteries. When facts are missing, character becomes a place where speculation settles. A raised voice becomes a theory. A reputation becomes a plot. But this can be unfair, especially when the person cannot answer. MacArthur was a man with a wife and children. He was present because the station needed him. He disappeared with the others. That is the firm ground. Anything beyond it should be handled gently. There is a human heaviness in the fact that MacArthur was there as a substitute. Had William Ross been well, the duty roster would have been different. That does not mean fate had selected MacArthur in some dramatic way. It simply shows how ordinary arrangements can place people in extraordinary events. A man falls ill. Another man takes the duty. A relief schedule continues. The light must be kept. Then history closes around the names of those who happen to be present. Many disasters have this quality. Later, people look back and see turning points that were just routine decisions at the time. A shift accepted, a journey taken, a boat boarded, a duty filled. Joseph Moore, though not one of the vanished three, belongs near them in this part of the story because he was part of the same working circle. He was the assistant lightkeeper on shore duty at Brasclet, and he was the man due to relieve the keepers. When the Hesperus finally reached the island, Moore was put ashore and went up to the station. That means the first familiar eyes to see the empty lighthouse belonged not to a stranger, but to a colleague. This matters. A stranger might notice absence. A colleague notices wrongness. He knows where things should be. He knows what a normal relief day should feel like. He knows the habits of the station, the signals, the expected movement of men coming down to meet the boat. When no one appeared, the silence would not have been vague, it would have been personal. Before that day, though, the station's life would have followed the patterns of lighthouse work. The men would have arranged watches, maintained the lamp, cleaned the lens and machinery, observed weather, prepared meals, checked stores, and dealt with whatever damage or wear the island produced. Such tasks sound plain when listed, but plain tasks can become demanding in isolation. There is no shop nearby for a missing part, no easy replacement if something breaks, no immediate extra pair of hands if a job proves harder than expected. The men had to rely on what was there and on each other. The lighthouse itself was still new. It had only been operating for a little over a year when the men disappeared. Newness did not mean softness. A new lighthouse could still be placed in an old and violent environment. The building and equipment may have been fresh, but the island had not changed its nature. The men were working at a station whose systems were established, but whose routines were still relatively young compared with older lights, where generations of keepers had built up long familiarity. Every station had its own habits, its own trouble spots, its own ways the weather found weaknesses. The Flannan Isles still had lessons to teach. One of those lessons involved the landings. For a lighthouse keeper on such an island, the landing places were not merely places where boats came and went. They were part of the station's survival. Supplies depended on them. Relief depended on them. Communication depended on them. Gear at a landing might need to be secured, checked, repaired, or protected because any damage could make future visits more difficult. If a storm threatened equipment there, a keeper might feel pressure to inspect it or prevent loss. That pressure would not come from recklessness. It would come from responsibility. A damaged landing was not someone else's problem. It was the station's problem. This is where the men's roles become important. Ducat, as principal keeper, may have felt particular responsibility for the condition of the station and its equipment. Marshall, as assistant, may have gone with him for the practical work required outside. MacArthur, if he was meant to remain inside, may still have been drawn out by concern, alarm, or the sight of danger to the others. These are possibilities, not certainties. But they are possibilities rooted in the work itself. They do not require melodrama. They require only weather, duty, and a moment in which one decision followed another too quickly to reverse. Inside the lighthouse, 3 men would have lived within a disciplined domestic world. There would be meals, cleaning, sleeping arrangements, and the ordinary awkwardness of shared space. Someone had to cook. Someone had to clean pots and pans. Someone had to keep things tidy enough for inspection and livable enough for the next day. Lighthouse work combined the technical and the household. A keeper might move from the serious business of tending a light to the humble business of washing up. That mixture makes the later discovery especially affecting. When a place is found empty but orderly, it suggests not chaos but interruption. The men had not abandoned a wrecked interior. They had left behind signs of routine. The records after the disappearance describe the lamp and apparatus as being in good order, with the day's work apparently completed. That points toward men who'd been doing what they were supposed to do before they vanished. There is no need to imagine a station descending into panic over many days. The known evidence suggests a working day that reached a certain point and then stopped. This is one of the reasons the story has such a grip. It does not present a long visible collapse. It presents ordinary completion followed by absence. The lamp cleaned, the equipment ready, the kitchen attended to. Then no men. The personalities of Ducat, Marshall and MacArthur are harder to recover than their roles. That's often true of working people in official records. Institutions preserve dates of service, positions, assignments, reports, and correspondence. They preserve the practical outlines. They rarely preserve the private texture. We may know when a man joined the service, but not what song he had stuck in his head while climbing lighthouse stairs. We may know his title, but not whether he missed home more in the morning or at night. We may know he had children, but not what he last said to them before leaving for duty. The mystery asks for details that history cannot always provide. Still, even those outlines can restore some scale. Ducat was in his mid-40s, a senior keeper with long service behind him. Marshall was younger and had maritime experience. MacArthur was standing in for another man and had his own family ashore. These were not anonymous shadows. They belonged to a working system and to households beyond it. When the light went out, the loss was not only operational, it was domestic. Somewhere, wives, children, relatives and colleagues would have had to absorb news that did not even come with the certainty of a body. Grief is hard enough when it has a clear event. It becomes even more difficult when the mind keeps returning to the same blank space. The families of lighthouse keepers understood risk, but understanding risk does not make loss easier. It may even make waiting worse, because the imagination has material to work with: weather, landings, cliffs, boats, delays, accidents. A family hearing that a relief vessel had not returned with expected news might begin with practical explanations: bad weather, a delay, a communication problem, a routine complication. Only later would the full shape become clear. The men were gone. The lighthouse was empty. No one could say exactly how their last minutes had unfolded. For their colleagues, the disappearance would also have struck deeply. Lighthouse service was a specialised world. Men knew the demands of remote stations. They knew what it meant to trust a relief schedule, to work in bad weather, to follow rules written because danger was real. When 3 keepers vanished from one station, it was not merely a public mystery, it was a professional wound. Other keepers could imagine the duties that might have taken them outside. They could picture the clothing, the landing, the gear, the thought process. They could imagine too much. Robert Muirhead, the superintendent who later investigated, had recruited the men and knew them. That detail gives the official inquiry a personal edge. He was not examining only a failed mechanism or an unknown staff list. He was looking into the disappearance of men whose faces and service were known to him. The official language remains measured, as official language tends to do, but behind it was shock. A remote lighthouse had lost its entire crew. A system built on routine had been broken by something sudden and final. The strange thing about Ducat, Marshall and MacArthur is that they are most vividly remembered through absence. We know them because they were not there when Mor arrived. We picture their coats because one was left behind. We think of their work because the lamp had been prepared. We imagine their final movements because the station was empty. It is a reversed kind of portrait, made not from what they did in front of witnesses, but from what remained after they were gone. That can make a story feel colder than it should, so it helps to pause with ordinary possibilities. Perhaps one of them had been annoyed by the weather that morning. Perhaps someone had made tea. Perhaps one man had mentioned the relief vessel and wondered when it would arrive. Perhaps someone had been looking forward to leaving the island for his turn ashore. Perhaps the men had spoken of repairs, of the west landing, of ropes and gear, of whether the sea would worsen. Perhaps they had said very little. Working men do not narrate their lives for future historians. They do the next task. The next task may be the key to everything. Not a secret message, not a hidden enemy, not a supernatural warning, just the next task. Something outside needed attention. One man noticed, another agreed. A coat was taken, boots were put on, the door was closed, the path was followed, the weather was present and the sea was active. At some point the safe world of the lighthouse was behind them, and the exposed world of Eilean Mor was around them. There is a deep sadness in how small the distance may have been between safety and disaster. Inside the lighthouse the men had walls, height, equipment and shelter. Outside they had judgment and footing. A few minutes, a short walk, a look toward the landing, and the situation could change. The island did not need to create a complicated trap. It only needed one powerful sea at the wrong moment. That is one of the most persuasive explanations because it fits the place and the work. It does not answer every emotional question, but it answers many practical ones. And yet the personal question remains. What did each man think was happening? Did Ducat and Marshall go first, intending to secure gear? Did MacArthur notice danger and follow? Did one man shout? Did the wind take the sound? Was there time to understand the size of the wave, or did it arrive as a force too large for thought? These questions cannot be answered from the records. They belong to the missing moment. But asking them reminds us that the three keepers were not simply the vanished men. They were three people caught in whatever that moment was. The names deserve to be spoken plainly. James Ducat, principal keeper, long in service, husband and father. Thomas Marshall, assistant keeper, formerly a seaman, unmarried, part of the working crew. Donald MacArthur, occasional keeper, present because another man was ill, husband and father. Joseph Moore, not vanished, but bound to the story by being the man who came expecting relief and found absence instead. These names are the human frame around the mystery. Without them, the story becomes only an empty lighthouse. With them, it becomes a workplace interrupted and families changed. As the days moved toward the middle of December 1900, there was no reason for the world beyond the island to imagine that these names would soon become linked forever. The light had its duty. The men had theirs. The relief system existed. The sea was rough because it was winter, but winter roughness was part of the job. Everything about the situation could still be understood as normal, right up until the point when it could not. That is how many strange histories begin. Not with thunder rolling at exactly the right dramatic moment, not with someone announcing that a mystery is about to happen, but with working men doing ordinary things in a place where ordinary things carry risk. A lamp is tended, a meal is cleared, weather is noted, boots are worn, a door is closed. Outside, the Atlantic moves against rock. Somewhere beyond the island, a ship expects to see a light, and soon that expectation will fail. The first sign that something was wrong did not come with shouting, wreckage, or a message sent in panic. It came as an absence. A ship passed through the dark, where the Flannan Isles lighthouse should have been showing its warning light, and the beam was not there. That is how the story begins to move from ordinary duty into lasting mystery. Not with a witness seeing the men in danger, not with a clear alarm from the island, just a missing light in winter weather, noticed from the sea. To a person on land, a dark window may not mean much. A lamp can be turned off because someone has gone to bed, left the room, or decided to save oil. But a lighthouse is different. Its light is not a private convenience. It is a public promise. It exists so that people far away from shore, moving through bad weather or uncertain water, can know where danger lies. When a lighthouse is meant to shine and does not, the darkness itself becomes information. It says something has failed, though it does not say what. The vessel connected with that first report was the SS Arcta, passing the Flannan Isles on December the 15th, 1900. She was making her way across the sea toward Leith, and in the ordinary course of navigation, the lighthouse should have been visible. The weather was poor, and visibility at sea is never a simple matter. A light may be hidden by haze, rain, distance, or the angle of a vessel's course. Sailors knew that. They did not need a mystery every time a beam failed to appear exactly when expected. But this was still a lighthouse, and the report mattered because the men on the ship believed the light should have been seen. Imagine that moment from the deck of the Arcta. Cold air, dark water, the ship moving steadily through the night, men who knew their route watching for the signals that confirmed where they were. Out there, the Flannans were not a tourist view or a famous mystery. They were a navigational point, a danger marked by light. A crew did not need to see the island clearly. They needed the beam. They expected it as part of the order of the voyage. When it failed to show, the blank place on the horizon must have felt wrong in a very practical way. There is no need to imagine panic on board. Sailors were used to uncertainty. They would know that weather could complicate sightings. They would also know that a light being out was serious enough to record and report. That combination is important. The first sign was alarming but not yet complete. It suggested a problem. It did not prove a disaster. The men on the Arcta could not simply stop the world and solve the matter from the water. They were passing by. They had their own voyage, cargo, crew, schedule, and safety to consider. The lighthouse was dark, but the island was remote, and no one on the ship could look into the keeper's rooms or walk the paths above the landing. All they could do was carry the information onward. In our time, it is difficult to accept how slowly concern could travel. Today, a failed light might be checked by radio, telephone, satellite link, monitoring system, or some other chain of immediate contact. A message could be sent in seconds. A distress call could be logged. A helicopter might be considered, depending on place and conditions. But in December 1900, the world was connected by ships, ports, telegrams, scheduled vessels, and human reporting. Information moved quickly compared with older centuries, but not instantly. It still had to be carried, noticed, passed along, and acted upon. That slowness gave the darkness time to deepen. The art store reached port days later. The report moved through channels after arrival. Meanwhile, Eilean Mor remained out in the Atlantic. If the men had already vanished, then by the time the first concern reached land, the lighthouse had already been empty for days. The station did not know it was being discussed. The island did not grow louder because someone ashore had begun to worry. The same room stood above the sea, the same tower waited, the same lamp, cleaned and ready according to later findings, remained without the hands that should have lit it. This is one of the hardest parts of the story to sit with. The men may have disappeared on the afternoon of December 15th, and the light was not seen that night. If that is right, then the first public sign followed very soon after the event itself. The missing beam was not a later clue. It was almost the immediate result of whatever had happened. The keepers were not there to light it. The duty that defined the station had stopped. A lighthouse can be strongly built, carefully designed, and properly supplied, but it still depends on human presence. Without the keepers, the tower becomes a silent object. The last day we can approach from the records is December 15th. The full lighthouse log was not brought up to date in the usual finished form, but notes had been made on the slate for later transfer, including weather readings and details connected with the light. This tells us something simple and important. The station was still operating that day. The men were not gone days earlier. The ordinary system of observation and recording was continuing. The work of the forenoon appears to have been completed. The lamp was later found prepared. The kitchen work was later judged to have been done. These details point toward a normal working morning, or at least a morning ordinary enough that the station remained under control. That makes the afternoon feel especially significant. It narrows the imagination without satisfying it. Sometime after the routine work was finished, something drew the men away from safety. It may have been damage at a landing. It may have been concern about gear. It may have been a practical issue that seemed urgent enough to inspect. Whatever the exact reason, the light was not lit that night. That single fact turns the unseen afternoon into the centre of the whole case. Picture the station during that day, not as a scene from a ghost story, but as a workplace. Morning tasks, weather readings, cleaning, checking, filling, cooking, conversation perhaps, a look outside, a decision about what needed attention. The sky may have been unsettled, the sea may have been high. Men used to such conditions would still have had to make judgments. The problem with dangerous work is that danger often wears ordinary clothes. It arrives in the form of a task that has been done before. Check the landing, secure the box, inspect a rope, look at storm damage, see whether something can wait, see whether it cannot. The men were trained to keep the light, but they were also responsible for the wider station. The landing places mattered because supplies and relief depended on them. Gear left vulnerable could be lost or damaged. A mooring rope box, a crane, railings or equipment near a landing could become essential when the next vessel arrived. In rough weather, a keeper might know that going out was risky and still feel that the risk had to be weighed against damage that could make future landings harder. This is not recklessness. It is the burden of responsibility in an isolated place. One reason the missing light unsettled people so much is that it contradicted the central discipline of lighthouse keeping. A keeper could be tired, lonely, cold, or worried, but the light had to be lit. Rules existed because maritime safety depended on them. For all three men to be absent when the light should have been working meant something had gone seriously wrong. Either they were prevented from returning, or they had all left under circumstances that placed them beyond the normal rules. Later investigators would note that leaving the light unattended broke regulations, especially if all three were outside. But rules are written for ordinary judgment, and emergencies have a way of forcing decisions that look different afterward. There is another possibility that sits quietly behind the facts. Perhaps not all three intended to be outside at first. Perhaps two went down, dressed for the weather, while one remained at the station. Then something happened that caused the third man to leave suddenly. This idea has often been suggested because of the clothing found at the lighthouse. It is a practical thought. A man hears or sees trouble. He steps out without full waterproof gear because the situation seems urgent. He does not plan to be gone long. He intends only to help, call out, or reach the others. Then the same danger takes him too. No one returns to light the lamp. That is only a reconstruction, not certainty. But it has the plain shape of real accidents. Many disasters are not caused by one grand decision. They are built from several small decisions made under pressure. One person goes to check, another follows, a third sees danger and runs to help. Each action makes sense in the moment. Only later, when all are gone, does the chain look fatal. Human beings are often drawn toward trouble when someone else may need help. It is one of our better qualities, and sometimes one of our most dangerous. While the island held the answer, the world outside had only the missing light. The Archter's observation entered the story as a report, but it did not immediately produce a rescue. Weather and logistics still controlled the response. The scheduled relief vessel, Hesperus, was due to make the ordinary relief around that period, but bad weather delayed her departure and arrival. That delay was not strange for the Flannans. The island could not be reached simply because a calendar said it was time. The sea had to allow it. In that sense, the same forces that may have caused the disaster also delayed its discovery. Days passed between the missing light and the arrival of help. That gap is part of why the story feels so lonely. If the accident happened on December 15th, then the lighthouse may have stood empty through night after night while the sea moved around it, and ships expected a beam that never came. The rooms would have been cold, the fire unlit, the beds unused. The clock stopped. Outside, weather continued its work. Any traces near the landing could be disturbed, covered, or carried away. Evidence in such a place did not wait carefully for investigators. To modern ears, it can sound almost impossible that an important lighthouse could remain unchecked for so long after its light went dark. But the records make the situation more understandable. The light was sometimes not visible from shore for several nights because of atmosphere and distance. A failure to see it did not always mean the light was unlit. Haze, weather, and the height of the island could hide it. People ashore had to judge not only whether the light was absent, but whether conditions should have allowed it to be seen. That uncertainty could soften alarm until other information arrived. This is another reminder that the past did not operate with our expectations. People were not foolish, because they lacked instant verification. They worked within the tools they had. A lighthouse on a remote island was both a triumph of order and a vulnerable system. Its beam could protect ships across miles of sea, but the men tending it could still be cut off by weather, darkness, and the absence of rapid communication. The same distance that made the light useful made the keepers hard to reach. There must have been a strange contrast between the seriousness of the missing light and the ordinary pace of life elsewhere. While Eilean Mor stood empty, people in towns continued preparing for Christmas. Shops opened, families made plans, letters were sent, meals were cooked, men went to work, children waited for holiday treats. The world did not stop because a lighthouse in the Atlantic had gone dark. Most people did not yet know. The families of the keepers may have expected delays, perhaps frustration, perhaps news when the relief vessel finally moved, They did not yet have the full shape of loss. That is how tragedy often begins for those outside it. Not as a blow, but as ordinary time continuing without permission. The dark and light was also a risk to ships. That practical danger should not be lost in the mystery. The Flannan Isles lighthouse existed because the waters needed marking. Without the beam, vessels passing in poor conditions had one less warning. The missing keepers were the human tragedy, but the unlit tower was also a navigational failure that could have led to further disaster. This meant the relief was not simply about checking on men. It was about restoring an essential aid to navigation. The light had to burn again. Still, no one yet knew whether the problem was mechanical, personal, accidental, or worse. A dark lighthouse could mean lamp failure. It could mean illness. It could mean a keeper injured and unable to perform duties. It could mean the men were present but incapacitated. It could mean storm damage. It could mean something no one wished to imagine. Until Hesperus reached the island, all these possibilities remained open. The darkness had spoken, but only in one word: absent. There is a quiet cruelty in that word. Absence gives the mind too much room. If there had been a clear distress signal, people could have responded to a defined emergency. If wreckage had been seen, the story would have taken a clearer shape. If one keeper had survived to explain, the others could have been mourned with knowledge. Instead, the first message was blank, no light, no explanation, no immediate voice from the island. The December night made that blankness larger. Winter at sea is not just colder, it changes the feeling of time. Darkness comes early and stays long. Weather can delay movement. The body becomes more aware of shelter, fire, dry clothes, and warm food. A lighthouse in summer may still be remote, but a lighthouse in December carries a heavier kind of isolation. Every unlit night would have mattered. Every hour without the beam widened the gap between the last known work and the eventual discovery. One can imagine the lamp room as evening approached on December the 15th. The apparatus ready, the duty expected, the time coming when the light should be lit. Yet no one climbed to perform the act. No hand completed the routine. No keeper turned the prepared system into a visible warning. The tower had been built for that moment, and the moment passed unused. The darkness outside became complete. It is important not to treat the extinguished light as if it were theatrical. For sailors, it was not a symbol, it was a missing safety signal. For the Northern Lighthouse Board, it would become part of an official disaster. For the families, it would become one of the first traces of the day their husbands, fathers and sons disappeared. For later generations, it became the image that keeps the story alive, a lighthouse of all things going dark. The irony is obvious, but it should be handled carefully. A lighthouse going dark feels like order failing in the one place. Order is most expected. It seems almost personal, as if the night had swallowed the very thing meant to oppose it. But the real point is simpler and sadder. The light went out because the men were gone. The tower did not fail first and cause the mystery, at least not according to the strongest evidence. The human absence caused the darkness. That makes the light not merely a clue, but a consequence. By the time the art store reached Leith and the report could be passed on, the dark night of December 15th was already part of the past. The ship had moved on. The island remained behind. Whatever had happened to Ducat, Marshall and MacArthur had likely already happened. This is why the story has such a strong feeling of delay. Everyone outside the island is late. The passing ship is late to understand. The report is late to arrive. The relief vessel is late because of weather. The investigators are late because discovery itself is delayed. The only thing not late is the sea. That delay gave rumour space later, but at the time it mainly created helplessness. A remote station could not be checked by concern alone. Someone had to get there. Hesperus had to sail. Conditions had to permit approach. A boat had to land. A man had to climb from the shore to the station and open doors. Until then, The dark light remained a problem without a face. The days between December the 15th and December 26th are among the most haunting in the story, because they are almost empty of events. We know what was not happening. The light was not being lit. The keepers were not sending signals. No routine welcome was being prepared. No relief was being received. But we do not know what traces remained fresh on the first day, the second day, the third. We do not know whether anything could still have been found near the landing before more weather arrived. By the time people reached the island, the first condition of the scene may already have been changed. This is one of the practical reasons mysteries endure. Not because there were too many clues, but because there were too few, and because the earliest moments were not observed. The Flannan Isles did not give investigators a sealed room. They gave them an exposed island after days of Atlantic weather. That is a very different thing. A broken railing, a missing lifebuoy, damaged gear, clothing left behind, a tidy lamp room, a stopped clock. These things could be examined, but they could not speak fully. They pointed, but not all the way. The missing light therefore sits at the centre of the transition. Before it, the men were keepers at a remote lighthouse. After it, they were missing men in an official disaster. Before it, Eilean Mor was a difficult station. After it, it became a place people would speak about for more than a century. The change began with sailors looking for a beam and finding darkness instead. There is something useful in keeping the first sign as plain as it was. No supernatural warning is needed. No invented screams. No dramatic message scratched into a wall. The story becomes stronger when it stays close to the record. A ship passed. The light was not seen. The men who should have lit it were no longer able to do so. Weather delayed the relief. Days later, Hesperus approached the island, not yet knowing exactly what her crew would find, but already moving toward the moment when absence would become undeniable. The dark nights before her arrival must have been ordinary to the island itself. The sea rose and fell. Wind crossed the grass. Birds settled where they could. The tower stood above it all, its purpose paused. On any other night, the light would have turned through darkness with a pattern known to sailors. It would have marked danger and offered guidance. Instead, the horizon held a gap where certainty should have been. Soon, the relief vessel would come close enough for men to search for the usual signs of life. They would expect movement, a flag, preparations at the landing, keepers ready to meet them. Those ordinary signs would matter because they belonged to the routine of relief. And when they were missing too, the absence first noticed from the sea would become something much more immediate, much more human, and much harder to explain. By the time Hesperus approached the Flannan Isles on December 26th, the story had already been waiting for 11 days. Not waiting in any official sense, perhaps. Not waiting with a clock on the wall and people counting every hour. But waiting in the colder, quieter way that remote places wait when something has happened, and no one has yet arrived to understand it. The lighthouse stood where it had stood before. The island rose from the Atlantic as it always had. The sea moved around the rocks, the wind crossed the grass, and the tower remained above it all, still built for service, still built for light, but now empty of the men who should have met the relief vessel. Hesperus was not coming as a rescue ship at first. She was the lighthouse tender, doing the kind of work that kept remote stations alive. Relief, supplies, contact, replacement, inspection, all the practical things that made lighthouse service possible beyond the mainland. Her arrival should have been part of a routine. Not an easy routine, because nothing involving the Flannan Isles was truly easy, but a known one. The vessel would approach, the keepers would appear, signals would be exchanged, men and supplies would be moved according to weather and sea. The relieved keeper would come aboard, perhaps tired, perhaps glad to leave the island for a while, perhaps already thinking of home, food, warmth, letters, and the small comforts of shore. That ordinary pattern was part of the reassurance of lighthouse life. A keeper could endure isolation because it had limits. The tour would end. Another man would come. The ship would appear when the weather allowed. In such places, the sight of the relief vessel must have meant more than transport. It meant connection. It meant the outside world had returned. It meant the long spell of sea, duty, and limited company was about to change. For Joseph Mor, that day was not meant to make him famous. He was the relief keeper, returning to a working station where he expected to find colleagues. He knew the place, or at least knew enough of its routines to understand what should happen when Hesperus came near. He was not a visitor arriving with no expectations. He was part of the same system. That made the first signs of wrongness sharper. A stranger can overlook what is missing. A colleague notices the missing things before he can explain them. As Hesperus drew near, the island would have come into view in its winter form: rock, slope, cliff, and the lighthouse standing high. The approach itself was already a negotiation with the sea. The vessel could not simply pull alongside a comfortable pier and lower a gangplank. The Flannans did not offer that kind of welcome. Landing depended on conditions. A small boat would be needed. Men would have to be put ashore carefully. Every movement from ship to island carried the old reality of the place. The lighthouse was a structure of order, but reaching it still meant dealing with water, rock, and weather. Captain Harvey and his crew looked for signs of life. There should have been movement, a man watching from above, a signal, some indication that the keepers had seen the tender and were preparing for the relief. At a remote lighthouse, such signs mattered. They were not social niceties, they were part of the rhythm of the work. A relief vessel arriving at a manned station should not feel like calling at an empty ruin. There should be human response. But Eilean Mor gave them nothing. No keeper came down, no figure appeared to meet them. No sign from the station reassured the men on Hesperus that all was well. The ship fired a rocket, hoping to attract attention, and still there was no response. That detail has a plain force to it. A rocket from a vessel near a lighthouse is not a subtle thing. It is meant to be noticed. It interrupts. It demands attention. If the keepers had been inside and able to respond, they would have known the tender was there. The silence after that signal was not ordinary delay. It was the first strong confirmation that the problem was not merely a missed sighting from days earlier. Something at the station was wrong. The island must have seemed strangely closed. Not physically closed because the land was in front of them, visible and reachable under the conditions of that day. But closed in the human sense. No greeting, no explanation, no voice. A place can feel deserted before anyone proves it. Hesperus had reached the shore of a working lighthouse station, but the station did not answer. There is a particular unease in arriving somewhere and not being met by the person who is supposed to be there. It happens in small forms in ordinary life. A door that should open remains shut. A friend who should be waiting is not at the station. A room that should contain voices is silent. Usually the explanation is simple. Someone is late. Someone has gone to fetch something. Someone has forgotten the time. But at a remote lighthouse in winter, after a report that the light had failed, silence carries more weight. It stops being inconvenience and becomes evidence. Mor was put ashore. That sentence is simple, but it contains a great deal. He left the relative safety of Hesperus and stepped into the scene that would define the mystery. At that moment he did not yet know exactly what he would find. He may have feared illness. He may have imagined an accident. He may have hoped, perhaps, that the men were somewhere out of sight and would appear at any moment with an explanation that made the whole business merely strange rather than terrible. Human beings often carry small hopes into bad situations because hope is practical. It gives the body permission to keep moving. The path from the landing up toward the lighthouse was not a gentle walk to a front door. It was a climb into the heart of the station. Mor would have known enough to read the absence around him as he went. No keeper coming down, no call from above, no activity around the place. The island itself was not large enough to hide a busy station. If the men were well and expecting relief, They should have been visible, audible, or at least suggested by recent movement. Instead, Mor advanced through a silence that grew more serious with each step. The lighthouse was ahead, familiar in shape but unfamiliar in mood. Buildings can feel altered by absence. A house with no one inside is still a house, but the mind notices what is missing. The same is true of a workplace. Tools may be in place, walls may stand, doors may be closed, but the lack of human movement changes everything. A lighthouse station without keepers is not peaceful in the usual sense. It is interrupted. The purpose of the place depends on people, and without them the building becomes a question. Mor reached the station and entered. The men were not there. This was the turning point. Until then, the missing light and the lack of response could still leave room for some explanation just beyond sight. The men might have been injured but alive. They might have been outside somewhere. They might have failed to hear, unlikely as that was. They might appear once the ship's men came closer, but inside the lighthouse, absence became solid. The rooms did not contain Ducat. They did not contain Marshall. They did not contain MacArthur. The 3 men who should have been present were gone. For Mor, this must have been more than a professional shock. These were not unnamed figures in a report to him. They were colleagues in a small and demanding service. He would have understood the habits of the station, the expectations of relief, and the seriousness of finding the place empty. He knew immediately that this was not how a lighthouse should be left. A keeper did not simply walk away from his duty. 3 keepers did not leave a station without explanation, with the light unlit, and fail to meet the tender. The absence was not normal. It was not even close to normal. The first search must have been hurried but careful, full of the strange mental motion that happens when a person is looking for someone he expects to find. A room is checked, then another. A name may be called. A pause follows. The mind waits for a reply. No reply comes. A door is opened. Nothing. A bed, a table, equipment, signs of use, no men. Each ordinary object becomes louder because the people are missing from beside it. He then returned to the landing with the news. That journey back down must have felt different from the climb. Going up, Mor was moving toward uncertainty. Coming down, he was carrying it. The men on Hesperus needed to be told that the station was empty, not damaged beyond use, not merely inattentive. Empty. Such news changes the air around a crew. It turns a routine relief into an emergency, and an emergency into a mystery almost at once. More men then went up with him. A proper search began. The island had to be checked, because if the keepers were not inside, perhaps they were outside, injured near the landing, trapped somewhere, fallen but alive, hidden by terrain. In a remote place, hope has to search, even when the facts are already narrowing. The men of Hesperus could not simply look into the rooms, find no one, and leave. The island itself had to be examined. But Eilean Mor gave no easy answer. No keeper was found waiting for help. No body lay near the path. No injured man called from the rocks. The land was small enough to search and harsh enough to make the search feel incomplete, even after it was done. That is another cruel feature of the place. On one hand, there were only so many places 3 men could be. On the other, cliffs, broken ground, weather, and the surrounding sea meant that not finding them did not mean they had never been there. A person taken by the water might leave little behind. The shore that day was empty in more than one sense. It was empty of the usual welcome, empty of explanation, empty of the men whose work tied the island to the human world. Hesperus had arrived expecting a change of crew, and instead found a station with its human chain broken. The relief vessel could bring men to the island, but it could not bring back the 3 who were gone. One can imagine the crew looking over the rocks and slopes with the practical eyes of seamen. They would know danger. They would know what water can do. They would understand that the absence of bodies was not proof of escape or trickery. The Atlantic can take quickly and leave little for those who come after. Still, Knowing that does not remove the strangeness. 3 men gone together from a lighthouse station. No final note, no witness, no clear sequence. The mind resists such a clean removal. There was also the responsibility of the light. However shocked the men were, the lighthouse still had to be restored to service. This is one of the details that keeps the story grounded. Even in mystery, work continues. Ships still needed warning. The tower still had a purpose. The disappearance of the keepers did not cancel the danger of the surrounding waters. Men had to remain on the island to attend the light while Hesperus returned with the news. That must have been an uncomfortable duty. To stay in a station just found empty, to sleep or keep watch where 3 men had recently vanished, and to continue the work they could no longer do. Mor and volunteers remained behind. That fact tells us something about lighthouse and seafaring life. There was fear, surely. Unease, certainly. But there was also duty. The light had to be kept. The station could not be abandoned just because the mystery was frightening. Someone had to climb the stairs, tend the lamp, and make the lighthouse what it was supposed to be again. The missing men had left a silence behind, and others had to work inside it. Hesperus then carried the news back. The message that went ashore was direct and grim. The keepers had disappeared. Official language would soon gather around the event, as it always does. Reports, inquiries, statements, conclusions. But before the official process began, there was this first human discovery. A relief keeper climbing to a lighthouse and finding it empty. That scene has remained powerful because it is easy to understand. No special knowledge of lighthouse engineering is needed, no complex physics, no legal detail. A man goes to relieve other men at a remote station. They do not greet him. He goes inside. They are gone. The simplicity makes it stronger. It gives the imagination a clean doorway through which to enter the mystery. Yet the simplicity also conceals how much Mor had to process. He had to observe, report, search, and keep working. He had to move from colleague to witness in a matter of minutes. He had to carry what he saw back to others. Later, people would retell the story many times, adding atmosphere and sometimes invention. Mor had no such distance. He had the immediate fact of empty rooms, bad weather, and missing men. The arrival of Hesperus also marks the moment when private danger became public mystery. Before that, whatever had happened belonged only to the island and the sea. After Hesperus, it belonged to families, officials, newspapers, lighthouse workers, and eventually the wider world. The island's silence had been found. Now it had to be interpreted. There is a difference between discovering that something is wrong and discovering what is wrong. Hesperus did the first. She arrived, signalled, landed Mor, and revealed the absence. The second would prove much harder. What had drawn the men out? Why had the light not been lit? Why were they all gone? Why was there no body, no clear mark of the final moment? Those questions did not arrive later as decoration. They were already present the moment Mor found the station empty. The shore remained the dividing line. On one side was Hesperus, with crew, captain, relief, and the world beyond the islands. On the other was Eilean Mor, with its silent lighthouse and missing keepers. Men could cross that line by boat, but the truth had crossed into a harder place. It was no longer sitting plainly in a room. It was somewhere among weather, memory, damaged equipment, missing clothing, sea conditions, and the unreadable last movements of 3 men. The empty shore also carried a practical message. If the keepers had been able to come down, they would have. Relief day mattered. Supplies mattered. Communication mattered. The arrival of Hesperus was not something they would ignore. Their failure to appear was not casual. It meant they could not appear. That conclusion may sound obvious now, but in the first moments, each missing sign would have pressed the point more firmly. No flag, no welcome. No answer to the rocket. No men at the door. No one inside. No one on the island. The facts arranged themselves into a shape no one wanted, and still, the lighthouse itself was not in ruins. That is part of what made the discovery so unsettling. A destroyed station would have told a clearer story. A fire, a collapse, a visible disaster. These would have explained absence through obvious force. Instead, the building stood. The rooms were there. The equipment was there. Much of the order of daily life remained. The men alone were missing. It made the station feel less like a place that had suffered an event and more like a place from which the human element had been suddenly removed. For a sleep story, this may seem like a strange place to rest the mind, but there is a quiet lesson in it. Not every mystery announces itself loudly. Some arrive through things not happening, a light not shining, a signal not answered, a door not opened by the person expected, a shore not receiving a ship in the usual way. The Flannan Isles story is built from these negatives, each one plain, each one calm on the surface, and each one leading toward the same conclusion. The men of Hesperus had come to relieve a lighthouse crew. Instead, they became the first witnesses to an absence that would outlive them all. Their approach to Eilean Mor turned a delayed concern into a confirmed disappearance. From that point on, the questions would move indoors and outdoors at once, through the rooms of the lighthouse and down toward the landing where the weather had left its marks. The station had not answered from the shore, but inside its closed spaces and ordinary objects there were still details waiting to be noticed. Inside its closed spaces and ordinary objects there were still details waiting to be noticed. Not the kind of details that solve a mystery in one satisfying moment, but the smaller kind. The kind that make people lean closer and then realise the answer has moved just beyond reach. The lighthouse was not smashed open. It was not burned. It was not filled with signs of a fight. It was not abandoned in the careless way of men who had chosen to leave their duty behind. The rooms were there, the equipment was there, the work of the station was largely in order, and yet the 3 men were missing. That is what made the first search so unsettling. If Mor had entered and found destruction everywhere, the mind would have moved quickly towards storm, fire, collapse, or some clear disaster. If he had found signs of violence, the questions would have taken another shape. If the men's belongings had all been gone, someone might have imagined deliberate escape, however unlikely that would be. But what he found was stranger because it was so normal in many places. It looked less like a station abandoned over time and more like a station interrupted during a working day. The entrance gate was closed. The outer doors were closed. These details are simple, but they matter. Closed doors suggest that the men had not fled in open panic from inside the building. They had not left every entrance wide to the weather. The station still held the shape of order. Mor made his way inside and found the kitchen door open. In the kitchen, the fire had not been lit for days. That would have been one of the first signs that the absence was not from that morning. A cold fireplace is not dramatic, but it is honest. It tells time in its own way. Ashes cool, heat leaves. A room that should have been warmed by human routine becomes cold enough to speak without words. The beds were empty. In Mor's description, they appeared as the men had left them in the early morning. That phrase carries a plain sadness. Beds are among the most personal objects in any working station. They are not mysterious by themselves. A bed is where a tired keeper rests after duty, where a man wakes before another day of work, where for a few hours the island can be held at a distance. Empty beds in a lighthouse do not prove what happened, but they show that the men had started the day in the normal way. They had risen. They had gone about their duties. They had not returned to sleep. There was also the stopped clock, or the stopped clocks as some reports describe them. A stopped clock always attracts attention in a disappearance because it seems to offer a time, or at least the hope of one. People want it to say, this is when everything changed. But clocks can stop for ordinary reasons, especially if they are not wound. A stopped clock in an empty building may only mean there was no one left to keep it going. Still, the image has stayed with the story because it feels exact, even if it is not exact enough. A clock stopped in a deserted lighthouse seems almost too fitting, as if time itself had noticed the absence and paused there with the furniture. But it is better to handle that detail carefully. The stopped clock does not need to be turned into a supernatural sign. It is more useful as a sign of neglect forced by absence. Lighthouse life depended on routine, and routine depended on the keepers. Wind a clock, light a fire, prepare food, clean the lamp, record the weather, check the equipment. One man may miss a task because he is tired. 3 men missing every task for days means the routine has been broken at its centre. The clock stopped because there were no hands left to wind it. That is enough. Then came the light room. In many versions of the story, people expect the lamp to be broken, dark and neglected, but the recorded details point in another direction. The lamp had been cleaned, the fountain was full, the lens and machinery were in order. The light had been prepared for use. That is an important fact because it tells us the keepers had completed at least the usual forenoon work on December 15th. They had not spent the day in disorder. They had not ignored the central duty of the station. The system was ready. What was missing was the final human act needed to turn readiness into light. A lamp ready to be lit is different from a lamp forgotten. It suggests intention. Someone had done the work that made the evening light possible. The cleaning, filling and preparation were not accidental. These were the practical tasks of trained men. The lighthouse was waiting for the next step and the men never came back to take it. That is why the prepared lamp is one of the strongest quiet clues in the case. It narrows the disappearance to a time after the morning duties, after the routine work, after the station had been put in order for the coming night. The kitchen told a similar story. The pots and pans had been cleaned. The kitchen had been tidied. The man acting as cook had completed his work. Again, this does not sound dramatic at first, but in a mystery like this, ordinary cleanliness becomes meaningful. A meal half-eaten on the table would suggest one kind of interruption. A room in chaos would suggest another. But a cleaned kitchen suggests a routine carried through. The work was done. The station was not in visible panic. The men had not been dragged away from breakfast or startled from sleep. They had moved through the day far enough for chores to be finished. This is where some popular retellings become less reliable. You may have heard versions that describe an untouched meal sitting on the table, or a chair knocked over as if someone had leapt up in terror. These details are often repeated because they are vivid. They make the scene feel like the opening of a ghost story. But the more careful records do not need them. In fact, adding too much drama can hide what is truly unsettling about the real scene. The kitchen was tidy, the lamp was ready, the building was in order, the men were gone. The plain version is stronger because it feels like life stopped between one ordinary duty and the next. The clothing was perhaps the most human clue of all. Clothing gives shape to movement. It suggests who planned to go where and under what conditions. Mor and later investigators considered what each man had likely worn outside. Thomas Marshall appears to have gone out properly equipped, with sea boots and oilskins. James Ducat also seems to have worn sea boots, and some form of waterproof covering. Donald MacArthur's usual coat, however, was left behind. Mor believed that this meant MacArthur had gone out without it, perhaps in his shirt sleeves. This detail has carried a great deal of weight in later theories. Why would MacArthur leave without his coat in December weather on Eilean Mor? One reasonable answer is urgency. If he had intended a long inspection outside, he would likely have dressed for it. If he saw or heard something sudden, he might have gone quickly. Maybe he believed he would only be outside for a moment. Maybe the other 2 men were already in danger. Maybe he stepped out to call to them, help them, or understand what was happening. A coat left on its hook can feel more personal than any official line in a report. It suggests a man who expected to return soon. That is not proof, of course. A missing coat or a coat left behind cannot explain an entire disappearance. It can only help us imagine the sequence. 2 men may have gone down first to inspect damage or secure gear near the western landing. They were dressed for the weather because the task was known. MacArthur may have remained at the station at first. Then something changed. Perhaps from the lighthouse or from the path, he saw the others in difficulty. Perhaps he heard a shout, though the wind and sea may have made hearing anything difficult. Perhaps he noticed a wave, damage, or some urgent movement. He left quickly, without the coat he usually wore. The door closed behind him, or was closed later by habit. He did not return. This reconstruction has a sad practicality to it. It is not built from monsters or secret visitors. It is built from work and concern. Men in small crews help each other. If one or two are in trouble, the third does not stand calmly inside and consider regulations. He goes. The same loyalty that keeps a lighthouse crew functioning could also draw all three men into the same danger. This is one of the reasons the clothing detail matters so much. It may show the difference between planned work outside and sudden response. The rules of the lighthouse service also come into this. The light was not supposed to be left unattended. At least one keeper should have remained. But rules are easiest to follow when events move at the speed expected by the rulebook. A sudden emergency does not always leave room for proper procedure. If MacArthur left last, and if he left because the others seemed to be in danger, then the breach of rules becomes understandable without becoming wise. It becomes human. The lamp remained ready, but the need outside may have seemed immediate. There is something very difficult about reading a room after its people are gone. Every object asks to be interpreted. The closed gate, the open kitchen door, the cold fireplace, the empty beds, the stopped clock, the lamp prepared for lighting, the cleaned kitchen, the missing outdoor clothing, MacArthur's coat left behind. Each item seems to point somewhere, but none points far enough. Together they form a rough outline of the day. Morning duties completed, men gone outside, no return before lighting time, days of silence, discovery by Mor. But the exact moment between leaving and vanishing remains blank. Investigators had to work with that blank. They were not writing a campfire tale. They were trying to understand a disaster and keep the lighthouse service operating. That meant separating what could be known from what could only be guessed. The interior of the station showed that the men had not been missing before December 15th. It showed that routine work had been carried out. It showed that the light was not lit because no keeper came back to light it. It suggested that the men left the building for some outdoor purpose. It did not show what happened after that. The rooms must have felt strange to the men left behind to keep the light going. Mor, MacDonald, Lamont and Campbell had to remain on the island after the discovery. They had to take over the duties of the missing men almost immediately. Imagine standing in that light room, handling equipment that had been prepared by hands now gone. The work could not wait for grief to settle. The lamp had to be lit that night. Ships still needed the warning. The machinery still needed attention. The lighthouse had to return to service while the absence remained fresh in every room. That is one of the more difficult parts of the story. The station could not be treated only as a scene of loss. It was also an active lighthouse. The new men had to move through the same spaces, sleep near the same empty beds, work around the same table and climb to the same light. There was no way to step entirely outside the mystery, because the only safe shelter on the island was the place where the mystery had begun. Work and unease had to share the building. Mor was reportedly upset, and it is easy to understand why. He had expected to relieve his colleagues, not replace them under such circumstances. He had been first into the empty station. He had seen the cold fireplace, the empty rooms, the stopped clock and the prepared lamp. He had run back down to the boat with the first news. Then he was sent back up, not for a brief inspection, but to stay. Even a steady man might feel nervous keeping watch in a lighthouse, where 3 others had disappeared only days before. Fear in such a situation would not be childish. It would be reasonable. The silence inside the building would have been different after the discovery. Before Mor arrived, the silence was unknown. Afterward, it had meaning. Every sound might seem louder. The wind at the windows, the movement of the lamp mechanism, footsteps on stairs, a door shifting slightly in a draught. Practical men may not speak dramatically about such feelings, but the body notices places where something has gone wrong. A person can tell himself the most likely explanation is an accident, and still feel the weight of the missing men in the next room. The stopped clock and left-behind coat became memorable because they put the mystery at human scale. A vanished body is hard to picture. A coat on a hook is easy. It tells us a person was there. It tells us he had habits. It tells us he expected conditions to require that garment, except perhaps in one urgent moment when he did not take it. The same is true of a clock. It is ordinary and domestic. It belongs to routine. When it stops, people notice because it shows that the daily pattern has lost its keeper. The lighthouse interior also worked against some of the more extreme theories. There was no confirmed sign that the men had fought each other. No confirmed sign that strangers had entered and taken them. No evidence that they had planned to leave the island willingly. The lamp and kitchen suggested discipline, not collapse. The clothing suggested an outdoor event, not a secret departure. This does not remove every question, but it does make some answers much less likely than others. At the same time, the interior alone cannot prove the sea took them. That proof would have needed bodies, witnesses, or direct marks of the final moment. Instead, the inside of the lighthouse gives us the beginning of the final movement. It tells us that the men likely left after morning work. It suggests that at least two dressed for rough outdoor conditions. It suggests that one may have left quickly. Then the trail moves out of the building down toward the weather, the landings and the damaged gear. The rooms can take us only to the door. That is why the story has to be read in two halves. Inside the lighthouse, everything points to interruption. Outside, the damage points to force. Between them is the missing action, the men moving from one to the other. If we stay only inside, the mystery feels almost impossible. 3 men vanish from tidy rooms. If we go outside, the picture becomes harsher and more practical. The island had been struck by heavy seas. Equipment had been moved or destroyed. Railings had been twisted. A lifebuoy had been torn away. A box containing mooring ropes had gone. The force outside was not imaginary. It had left marks. Still, it is worth lingering a little longer with the interior because it is where the emotional power of the case gathers. The light room ready. The kitchen cleaned. Beds empty. Clock stopped. Coat left. These are not grand clues. They are working objects, domestic objects, ordinary things. They remind us that the men did not disappear from a legend. They disappeared from a workplace where someone had tidied the kitchen, filled the lamp and expected the next part of the day to arrive. Perhaps that is why the Flannan Isles case remains so effective. It does not depend only on the final danger, it depends on the contrast between order and absence. Human beings create order so we can live in difficult places. We build walls, make schedules, keep records, wind clocks, clean kitchens, and hang coats by doors. On Eilean Mor, all that order was present. Then 3 men stepped outside it, and the island took the story beyond the reach of any room, any clock, or any report. So when people speak of clocks and coats, they are really speaking of the last evidence of ordinary life. They are speaking of a station that had not yet understood it was about to become famous for all the wrong reasons. They are speaking of men whose final movements can only be partly reconstructed from the things they did not come back to use. A clock that no one wound, a coat that one man did not take, a lamp that no one lit, a kitchen that no one warmed again. The search could not remain indoors. The building had given all it could give. It had shown the absence, the interrupted routine, and the likely direction of the men's final task. To understand why trained keepers might fail to return, Mor, the volunteers, and later Muirhead had to follow the evidence away from the rooms and toward the part of the island where the sea had left damage severe enough to make even experienced lighthouse men pause. The search could not remain indoors. The building had given all it could give. It had shown the absence, the interrupted routine, and the likely direction of the men's final task. To understand why trained keepers might fail to return, Mor, the volunteers and later Muirhead had to follow the evidence away from the rooms and toward the part of the island where the sea had left damage severe enough to make even experienced lighthouse men pause. The West Landing was not just another edge of the island, it was one of the working points that connected the lighthouse to the outside world. Supplies, ropes, boats, cranes and landings were not background details in a place like Eilean Mor. They were part of the station's ability to survive. If something there had been damaged, it mattered. If gear had been loosened or threatened by the sea, it could affect future reliefs, future supplies, and the safety of anyone trying to come ashore. A town worker might ignore a damaged box until morning. A lighthouse keeper on a remote island might not have that luxury, especially if the object belonged to the difficult business of landing boats. When Muirhead examined the area, the signs of force were not small. Railings were damaged. A lifebuoy had disappeared, not because someone had neatly untied it, but because the ropes showed that the sea itself appeared to have torn it away. A heavy block of stone had been shifted from its position and carried down onto the concrete path. These are not gentle marks. They suggest water moving with enough power to reach high, push hard, and leave behind a scene that looked almost unbelievable unless a person saw it with his own eyes. This is where the most plausible explanation begins to take shape. Not perfectly, not with every question answered, but with enough practical sense to hold together. The men may have gone down toward the West Landing on the afternoon of December 15th because they believed something there needed attention. Perhaps they wanted to secure the box containing mooring ropes. Perhaps they wanted to inspect the damage after heavy weather. Perhaps they thought one part of the landing equipment was in danger of being lost. Two of them may have dressed for outdoor work, expecting a difficult but manageable task. The third may have followed later in haste. Then an unexpectedly large sea came over the rocks, rose higher than they judged possible and swept them away. It is a plain explanation, and because it is plain, some people find it unsatisfying. A mystery that has lasted for more than a century seems to demand something stranger. A hidden visitor, a fight, a monster from the water. A secret message, a curse carried on the wind. But the sea does not need to be imaginative to be deadly. It only needs timing, force, and people standing in the wrong place for a few seconds. The word often used in later retellings is rogue wave. That phrase can make the event sound rare, almost legendary, as if one wave rose from the Atlantic with a plan. The official language was more practical. Muirhead spoke of an unexpectedly large roller. A roller is a large swell or breaking sea, and near cliffs and landing places it can behave in ways that are difficult to judge from a distance. Water hitting rock does not simply stop. It climbs, rebounds, throws spray, surges through gaps, and comes down again with force. On a wild coast, the danger is not only the wave coming in, it is the water returning, dragging, pulling, and sweeping loose objects and people with it. A person standing near such a place may think he is far enough back. He may have seen many seas strike the rocks and fall short. He may believe the present conditions are bad but known. Then one larger sea arrives, built by wind, swell, tide, and the shape of the coastline. It reaches higher, it comes faster, it fills a space that was dry a moment before, it knocks a man off balance. Once footing is lost, the rest can happen with frightening speed. Heavy clothing, boots, cold water, rock, and shock make survival unlikely. If 3 men were caught together, there might have been no time for rescue. No time even for a clear cry that could carry back to the lighthouse. The West Landing damage gave Muirhead a reason to believe the sea had reached places it should not ordinarily reach. The lifebuoy detail is especially important. A lifebuoy exists because danger is expected near water. It is a piece of safety equipment, fastened for emergency use. But in this case, the sea appears to have torn it from where it was secured. That means the same force that could remove a buoy might remove a man. It does not require a supernatural event. It requires a level of water movement strong enough to break or tear practical fittings from their place. The displaced stone adds another kind of evidence. A stone weighing more than a person, shifted by water, is a quiet argument. It does not care about theories. It simply shows that force was present. When a heavy stone has been moved from higher ground and carried down onto a path, it tells us that the storm or sea action had not been ordinary. It also reminds us how little strength a human body has against moving water. A man may be strong, experienced, and alert, but a large body of water does not negotiate with strength. It strikes all at once. Still, the theory has to explain why all three men were outside. That is the part that keeps many listeners uneasy. Lighthouse rules required that the light not be left unattended. One man should have remained behind. If Ducat and Marshall went down to inspect the landing, why did MacArthur go too? The coat left behind offers one possible answer. He may not have been part of the original outdoor task. He may have stayed inside at first. Then he may have seen or heard trouble and rushed out without dressing properly. If he believed Ducat and Marshall were in danger, he would not be thinking first about the regulation. He would be thinking about reaching them. This kind of sequence is common in accidents. One person gets into difficulty, another goes to help, a third follows. The danger that caught the first person then catches the rescuers. It happens in rivers, on ice, in mines, on cliffs, and at sea. It is tragic because every action can be understandable. No one has to be foolish. No one has to be reckless. Each person may be doing what seems right in the moment, and the situation becomes fatal because the force involved is larger and faster than the human response. In the Flannan case, perhaps two men were working near the landing when a wave struck. MacArthur, seeing them in trouble, ran out. Or perhaps all three had gone together despite the rules because the damage seemed urgent and the task seemed to require more hands. Maybe they believed the worst of the storm had passed. Maybe the sea looked dangerous but not impossible. Maybe they had done similar tasks before and returned safely. Familiar danger can be one of the most deceptive kinds. It teaches respect, but it also teaches patterns, and sometimes the pattern breaks. The weather itself has often been given an exaggerated role in popular versions of the story. Some retellings describe wild storms on earlier dates and dramatic log entries that do not belong securely to the record. Those additions create atmosphere, but they can distract from the real evidence. The strongest case does not depend on invented terror in the logbook. It depends on damage found on the island, the clothing left and missing, the work completed inside, and the absence of the men after the afternoon of December 15th. The facts are fewer than the legends, but they point in a clear direction. Muirhead also considered whether the men might have been blown over by the wind. That would be understandable at first, because wind on Eilean Mor could be severe, and a cliff edge in strong wind is a dangerous place. But he rejected that as the less likely explanation because of the wind direction. If the wind was westerly, he reasoned, it would have blown the men up the island rather than over the relevant edge. He believed they would have had a chance to throw themselves down before being carried far enough. Water, not wind, made more sense to him. Water could strike, rise, and sweep them away with enough force to leave no bodies behind. That judgment came from a man who knew the lighthouse service, knew the missing keepers, and examined the island soon after the discovery. It is not perfect proof, but it deserves weight. Later storytellers can sit in comfortable rooms and invent possibilities. Muirhead stood near the damage, looked at the gear, considered the clothing, took statements, and tried to explain a disaster that had affected men he had personally known. His conclusion was not theatrical, it was practical, and perhaps for that reason, it has remained the strongest explanation. The sea theory also explains the lack of bodies. In some disappearances, no body suggests a mystery beyond accident. On an exposed Atlantic island, it does not. A man swept into rough water near cliffs could be pulled away, battered against rocks, carried by currents, or lost beyond recovery. Searchers arriving days later would have little chance if the sea had already taken them. The delay between the likely accident and the discovery made this even more likely. By December 26th, whatever the sea had done on December 15th had been followed by 11 days of weather, tide and movement. It also explains why there was no final written message. The men did not know they were about to disappear. They were not trapped for days with time to write. They likely left for a task that seemed immediate and expected to return. A note is written when a person has time to understand danger from a distance. A sudden wave gives no such time. The absence of a message is not suspicious in this theory. It is exactly what one would expect from a quick accident. The prepared lamp fits as well. The men had completed the forenoon work. They had cleaned and prepared the light. Then something outside required attention before lighting time. They went out and did not return. Evening came. The lamp remained ready but unlit. The arch door passed and saw no light. Days went by. Hesperus arrived to silence. The sequence is grim, but it is coherent. The theory also fits the clothing. Ducat and Marshall appear to have been dressed for outdoor conditions. MacArthur's coat remained behind, suggesting a sudden departure or a shorter intended absence. If MacArthur had simply joined a planned inspection from the beginning, he might have taken his coat. If he rushed out later, he might not have. Again, it is not proof, but it matches the rescue chain possibility. What remains difficult is the exact movement of the men. Did they go down together from the beginning? Did two go first and one follow? Were they near the crane, the mooring ropes, the railings, or the path when the water struck? Did they see the wave coming? Did one survive for a moment longer than the others? Did anyone reach for the rail? Did anyone call out? These questions cannot be answered. They are the part the sea kept. The official theory explains the general cause, but not the final seconds. That may be why people keep returning to other ideas. A plausible explanation can solve the event while still leaving the imagination restless. Human beings often want not only a cause, but a scene. We want to see the exact moment. We want to know who stood where, who spoke last, who made the decision, and whether anyone understood what was happening. The Flannan Isles do not give us that. They give us enough to believe, but not enough to witness. There is another reason some people resist the wave theory. It feels too sudden. 3 experienced men gone at once, in a place they knew, by a danger they understood. But experience is not armour. Lighthouse keepers could reduce risk, not remove it. Sailors drown. Climbers fall. Miners are trapped. Farmers are killed by machinery they have used for years. Familiar work remains dangerous when the environment is powerful enough. The very fact that Ducat, Marshall and MacArthur were experienced may mean they were willing to handle tasks on the island that a visitor would never attempt. They knew the station needed care, and they had the confidence of working men used to difficult conditions. There is a quiet respect in accepting the accident theory. It does not make the men foolish. It does not turn them into villains or victims of fantasy. It places them in the reality of their work. They were keepers at a remote lighthouse. They saw or suspected damage. They went to deal with it. The sea overtook them. The loss is not smaller because it is practical. It may be larger because it reminds us how dangerous ordinary duty can be. At the same time, the word plausible matters. It is not the same as certain. No one saw the wave take them. No bodies confirm the cause. No recovered object told the full story. Muirhead's conclusion is the strongest known explanation because it makes sense of the evidence, not because it closes every gap. A good investigation can reach probability without reaching certainty. That is where the Flannan Isles mystery remains. The most likely answer is clear enough to state, but not clear enough to end all wondering. The island's geography helped create both the accident and the uncertainty. High cliffs and exposed landings meant the sea could strike with unusual force. The same cliffs and sea meant evidence could vanish. A mainland accident might leave tracks, witnesses, debris or bodies. Eilean Mor gave investigators damaged gear and silence. Even the damage itself was partly ambiguous. It showed force, but not the men's exact positions. It told the searchers where to look, but not what had happened second by second. Imagine the men near the west landing. It is afternoon. The work inside is done. The air is cold, the sea is active. Perhaps one of them is studying the damage. Perhaps another is handling rope or checking a box. The sound of water against a rock is constant enough that one more wave may not seem different until it is too late. A large roller rises, driven by the swell and shaped by the island. It comes up with more height and weight than expected. Water pours over the area, through railings, across the path, around the gear. A man loses his footing. Another reaches. The force knocks them down. The returning water pulls them toward the edge. Heavy boots and oilskins become burdens. The Atlantic closes over the moment before any record can be made. That may be all. No haunting, no hidden figure, no secret. Just the speed of water and the vulnerability of people. It is almost too simple for a famous mystery, but simple things can be devastating. The light, waiting above, would not know. The clock inside would not know. The kitchen, the beds, the coat on the peg, none of these would know. Objects wait without understanding. Evening would arrive as usual. The time for lighting would come. No one would climb to the lamp, no one would make the signal that ships expected. The tower would stand in darkness, not because the mechanism had failed, but because the men who gave it purpose had been taken from the island. There is no need to force certainty where the record does not allow it. The most honest version is this. The evidence strongly suggests an accident near the west landing, probably involving a sudden and powerful sea that swept the 3 men away. That explanation fits the damaged equipment, the missing clothing, MacArthur's coat left behind, the completed work inside the station, the unlit lamp, and the lack of any sign of voluntary departure or violence. It does not answer every emotional question. It does not let us hear the final words. It does not bring the men home. But it gives the story a sober centre. And from that sober centre, the legends begin to grow. Because people do not always leave a mystery alone, especially one set on a lonely island, with a dark lighthouse, stopped clocks, missing men, and a sea that refuses to give back what it took. Over time, the practical theory remained in the reports, while other versions moved through newspapers, books, conversations, and late-night retellings, each one adding something stranger to the empty rooms and the damaged landing. The reliable record supports a likely sea accident near the west landing, while many famous details, including the untouched meal, overturned chair, frightening diary entries, crying keepers, and supernatural explanations, belong to later retellings rather than the strongest evidence. Wilfred Wilson Gibson's 1912 poem helped spread some of the more dramatic imagery, and later culture kept reworking the case in opera, television, film, and fiction. Over time, the practical theory remained in the reports, while other versions moved through newspapers, books, conversations, and late-night retellings, each one adding something stranger to the empty rooms and the damaged landing. That is often what happens when a real event leaves a gap. People do not like gaps. They look at them for a while, then begin placing things inside them. A missing detail becomes a whispered warning. A stopped clock becomes a sign. A coat left behind becomes proof of panic. A dark lighthouse becomes more than a dark lighthouse. It becomes a place where almost anything can be imagined, because the one thing everyone wants most, a clear witness to the final moment, is missing. The Flannan Isles mystery was well suited for this kind of growth. It had all the parts a legend needs, even before anyone added anything extra. A remote island, 3 men alone, a winter night, a lighthouse that failed to shine, no bodies, no final note. A relief crew arriving to silence, damage near the shore, a sea powerful enough to remove evidence. These facts already sound like the beginning of a ghost story, even when told plainly. The official explanation may be sensible, but the setting keeps inviting the imagination to walk back in and look around one more time. This does not mean people were foolish for wondering. Wondering is natural. If 3 men disappear from a lighthouse and no one sees what happened, questions will gather around the event. The trouble begins when questions slowly harden into details that were never there. A possible fear becomes a recorded fear. A later poem becomes a witness statement. A dramatic version becomes the version people remember because it is easier to picture. Human memory likes scenes. It likes chairs knocked over, meals left cold, final words in a logbook, and men staring into the storm with dread on their faces. The real record is usually quieter and less convenient. One of the best-known additions is the untouched meal. In many popular versions, the relief crew enters the lighthouse and finds food still sitting on the table, as if the keepers had been interrupted in the middle of eating. Sometimes a chair is described as overturned. Sometimes the room seems frozen at the exact second of alarm. It is a strong image. It tells the audience what to feel immediately. The men were here. Something frightened them. They jumped up. They never returned. For a storyteller, it is useful. For the actual case, it is not reliable. The more careful accounts say the kitchen utensils were clean, and that the kitchen work had been completed. That suggests the men did not rush away in the middle of a meal. It suggests they left after the ordinary work of eating and tidying had already been done. This is less dramatic, but it is more useful. It changes the scene from sudden interruption at the table to a later outdoor task. It brings the story back to the landing, the damaged equipment, the missing protective clothing, and the likelihood of a sea accident. But the untouched meal has survived because it is easy to remember. A clean kitchen is a clue. An untouched meal is a scene. The overturned chair works the same way. A chair lying on the floor is one of those details that seems to speak loudly. It suggests haste, fear, argument, or shock. It gives the mind a clear object to focus on. Yet that detail is tied strongly to later literary retelling, especially the poem that helped fix the mystery in public imagination. The poem is powerful because it understands the mood of the story, but a poem is not an inspection report. It can use details because they feel true to the atmosphere, not because they were written down by the men who searched the station. Once those details enter the public version, they are hard to remove. They feel as if they have always belonged there. Then there are the supposed logbook entries. These are among the most dramatic parts of the legend, and also among the least reliable. In some versions, Thomas Marshall records terrible winds unlike anything he has seen in 20 years. Ducat is described as unusually quiet. MacArthur, often portrayed as a tough man, is said to be crying. Another entry has the men praying as the storm continues. The final line is sometimes given as something solemn about the storm ending, the sea becoming calm, and God being over all. It is easy to see why these lines spread. They sound like the last page of a Gothic novel. They give the disappearance a growing sense of dread, as if the men knew something unnatural was approaching. The problem is that these entries do not belong securely to the known lighthouse records. They appear to be later inventions or embellishments. The actual records do not give us a neat sequence of fear rising day by day. They do not show the 3 men losing their nerve inside a solid lighthouse while a storm rages outside for several days. They show ordinary work, weather readings, and a station that appears to have functioned normally until the day the men vanished. Again, the true version is quieter. It does not give us a written warning. It gives us a working day, a prepared lamp, missing men, and damage outside. The invented logbook entries also create problems with the men themselves. They encourage listeners to imagine Ducat, Marshall, and MacArthur as frightened figures trapped by some mysterious pressure. But these were lighthouse keepers, not visitors hiding in a cottage during their first storm. They knew bad weather. They knew isolation. They knew that a lighthouse was built to withstand conditions that would terrify someone unused to them. That does not mean they could not feel fear. Everyone can feel fear. But the melodramatic version turns them into characters arranged for effect, rather than working men caught in a practical disaster. Another set of theories points toward madness, conflict, or murder. These usually begin with the idea that isolation can change people. And that is not wrong in a general sense. Remote work can be hard. 3 men in a confined station, surrounded by bad weather, could become irritated or tense. Small disagreements might feel larger when there is nowhere else to go. Lighthouse service required discipline partly because isolation and routine can wear on the mind. But turning that general truth into an explanation for the Flannan disappearance requires evidence, and the evidence is not there. The station did not show clear signs of a violent struggle. There were no bodies, there was no blood, no confirmed weapon, no reliable confession, and no final report of a serious quarrel. The murder theory often leans on descriptions of Donald MacArthur as a volatile man. Some retellings use this to suggest that he attacked the others, or that a fight broke out near the cliff. This is a fragile way to build a theory. A reputation, especially one repeated after death, can be unfair. Even if MacArthur had a temper does not explain 3 vanished bodies without further evidence. It also does not explain the damaged landing gear as well as the sea theory does. A fight may make the story more dramatic, but it does not fit the practical facts as neatly as men being swept away while dealing with storm damage. There are also theories of voluntary disappearance. According to these, the men might have left the island deliberately, perhaps taken away by a passing ship to start new lives. It is an idea that appears in many mysteries because it offers a strange kind of escape. Instead of death, there is secret survival. Instead of tragedy, there is hidden reinvention. But at Flannan, this does not make much sense. The island was remote. Leaving secretly would require outside help, planning, timing, and silence from everyone involved. The men had families and duties. The light being left unlit would put ships at risk and immediately draw official attention. Their belongings in the station do not suggest a planned departure. It is possible to imagine it, but imagining is not the same as explaining. Foreign spies have also appeared in some versions, which shows how far the story travelled from the evidence. A remote lighthouse, missing men, and no bodies can become almost anything if the storyteller is willing. Spies make a mystery feel larger, as if the island were not only lonely but politically important. Yet there is no solid reason to think secret agents came to Eilean Mor, removed 3 keepers, and vanished without a useful trace. The theory says more about the human love of hidden enemies than about the lighthouse itself. Then come the sea monsters. A sea serpent carrying the men away is one of those explanations that survives because it is memorable, not because it is likely. The Atlantic around the Flannans was dangerous enough without adding a creature to it. In earlier centuries, sailors often explained strange seas, missing ships and frightening sounds through monsters, because the ocean was difficult to understand and harder to map in detail. Even by 1900, old sea stories had not disappeared. A place like the Flannans, with cliffs, caves, heavy swells and sudden water movement, could easily feed that older style of thinking. If the sea takes men and gives nothing back, people may start giving the sea a face. Ghost stories followed for the same reason. The Flannan Isles were already remote, and local tradition gave the wider island group an older atmosphere. The islands were sometimes connected with the name Seven Hunters, and later retellings leaned into that name as if it carried a warning. Some stories introduced ghostly boats or phantom presences, as if the vanished keepers are being claimed by something that had haunted the rocks long before the lighthouse was built. These stories are not evidence, but they are understandable as folklore. Remote places collect this kind of material. The less often people visit a place, the more room there is for stories about what happens there when no one is watching. A ghost story does not need to be believed literally to be meaningful. It can show how people felt about the event. The Flannan case left people with discomfort that the official theory did not completely remove. A wave could explain the deaths, but it could not provide a body, a witness, or final words. Folklore steps into that discomfort and gives it shape. It says the island is haunted. The sea wanted them. The light was cursed. The men saw something. The dead were waiting. These statements are not reliable history, but they are emotional responses to uncertainty. The poem by Wilfred Wilson Gibson did a great deal to fix the mystery in the public mind. Published more than a decade after the disappearance, it turned the case into a memorable piece of literature. It captured the image of men arriving at a lighthouse and finding no trace of the keepers. It helped make the story feel like a permanent riddle. But because the poem included details that were not supported by the official record, it also helped blur the line between evidence and atmosphere. Many people encountered the Flannan story first, through that poetic version, or through later retellings influenced by it. By then, the clean kitchen could easily become an untouched meal, and the absence could become something staged for terror. This is not unusual. Literature often becomes the doorway through which people enter historical events. A poem, film, or play gives the mind a strong first picture. Later corrections can feel weaker because they lack that first emotional force. Tell someone there was no reliable untouched meal, and they may understand the correction. But the picture of the meal may remain anyway. The imagination has already placed it on the table. The case continued to spread through culture. Peter Maxwell Davies created an opera based on the event, turning the disappearance into a psychological and musical drama. Doctor Who drew inspiration from the mood and idea of a lighthouse under threat, using the setting for science fiction rather than strict history. The film The Vanishing used the case as a basis for a fictional thriller. Books and television programs have returned to it many times. Each version changes the story because each version has a different purpose. An official report tries to explain, a poem tries to affect, a film tries to hold attention, a ghost story tries to unsettle, a documentary tries, ideally, to separate what is known from what is guessed. That is why the Flannan Isles mystery has several lives. There is the historical life made of dates, names, weather, reports, clothing, equipment, and damage. There is the emotional life, made of families, colleagues, shock, and grief. There is the folklore life, made of ghosts, monsters, omens, and strange lights. And there is the entertainment life, where the lighthouse becomes a stage for fear, conflict, and invention. These lives overlap, but they are not the same. Confusing them can make the story louder, but not clearer. The official theory is not boring just because it is natural. A sudden sea sweeping 3 men from a remote landing is frightening in a very real way. It means there was no villain to blame, no secret to unlock, and no dramatic final confrontation. It means 3 trained keepers may have been doing their duty when the Atlantic reached farther than expected. That kind of event can be harder to accept than a monster, because it is not safely fictional. It belongs to the world people actually live in. Weather changes. Waves rise. Work has risks. A man may step outside for a task and never come back. But the myths tell us something too. They tell us that people wanted the Flannan disappearance to have meaning beyond accident. They wanted the darkness to signify more than failed routine. They wanted the stopped clock to be a message, the coat to be a warning, and the empty station to be proof that ordinary explanations were not enough. In a way, the myths are a record of discomfort. They show the pressure created when evidence gives probability but not certainty. The mind keeps working because it has not been fully released. It is worth being gentle with that impulse. People who repeat ghost stories are not always trying to distort history. Sometimes they are trying to stay close to a story that unsettled them. A supernatural explanation can be a way of saying, this event feels too strange to leave alone. A sea monster can be a way of giving a body to the power of the sea. A phantom boat can be a way of picturing disappearance itself. The problem comes when these images replace the men and the facts. Duckett, Marshall, and MacArthur deserve better than to be turned only into props for a scary tale. A careful telling can hold both things at once. It can say that the ghost stories are part of the afterlife of the case, while also saying they are not the best explanation. It can acknowledge that the island feels eerie without pretending that eeriness is evidence. It can enjoy the strangeness of the legend while still returning to the West Landing, the damaged railings, the missing lifebuoy, the displaced stone, the clothing, and the official conclusion. The facts may not solve every detail, but they deserve to remain the centre. There is also a practical lesson here about famous mysteries in general. The longer a mystery is retold, the more important it becomes to ask where each detail came from. Was it in an official report? Was it in a first-hand letter? Was it from a newspaper trying to attract readers? Was it from a poem? Was it added decades later by someone summarising from memory? A mystery is not only made of events, it is made of transmission. The way the story travels can change the story itself. The Flannan Isles case shows this clearly. The earliest evidence points toward a sudden outdoor accident. The later legend points toward fear inside the lighthouse, strange behaviour, impossible weather, and supernatural dread. The difference between those two versions is not a small matter. It changes the men from keepers doing work into characters waiting for doom. It changes the sea from a real danger into a stage prop. It changes the lighthouse from a workplace into a haunted house. That may make the story more dramatic, but it also makes it less fair. Still, even after removing the inventions, something remains. 3 men disappeared, no bodies were found, the light went dark, Hesperus arrived to an empty station. The strongest explanation is a wave, but no one saw it. That is enough mystery for one island. The truth does not need extra furniture around it. It does not need the untouched meal, the overturned chair, the crying keeper, or the sea serpent. The real uncertainty is quieter and stronger. It sits in the space between likely and certain. Perhaps that is why the story has lasted. If the official report had found the bodies, described the accident completely, and closed the case with full proof, the Flannan Isles would still be a tragic event, but not the same kind of legend. If there had been clear evidence of crime, it would be remembered differently. Instead, it remains balanced between explanation and absence. We can stand very close to the answer, close enough to see its outline, but not close enough to touch every part of it. The myths that followed are like marks left by generations of listeners. Each one reveals what people found hardest to accept. Some could not accept that the sea alone had done it. Some could not accept that 3 experienced men could all be caught. Some could not accept that a working lighthouse could become empty without a stranger entering the scene. Some could not accept that the final moment had no witness. So they added one in the form of a ghost, a monster, a secret ship, a violent quarrel, or a final written warning. In each case, the addition made the blank feel less blank. But when we return to Eilean Mor itself, the simpler picture waits. The island does not need the later decorations. It has the tower, the landing, the rocks, the weather, and the sea. It has the path from the rooms to the shore. It has the place where equipment was damaged. It has the memory of a relief keeper opening doors and finding no one. It has enough. So the ghost stories can be left where they belong, not dismissed with mockery, but placed carefully beside the record. They are part of how people responded to the disappearance. They are part of the cultural echo. They are not the strongest explanation for what happened to Duckett, Marshall and MacArthur. The most plausible explanation remains physical, sudden and severe. But the legends show how deeply the event entered public imagination, and how hard it is for people to leave an empty lighthouse empty. And after all the theories have moved through the room, after the sea monsters have slipped back into old sailors' talk, after the invented logbooks have been set aside, after the ghost boats have faded back into fog, the actual lighthouse remains. It still stands on Eilean Mor. The island still sits west of Lewis. The Atlantic still moves around it. The names of the 3 men remain attached to the place, and the story continues not because every wild theory is possible, but because the plain facts still leave one narrow door open. Through that door comes the final unease of the case, and the reason people are still drawn back to the tower more than a century later. And after all the theories have moved through the room, after the sea monsters have slipped back into old sailors' talk, after the invented logbooks have been set aside, after the ghost boats have faded back into fog, the actual lighthouse remains. It still stands on Eilean Mor. The island still sits west of Lewis. The Atlantic still moves around it. The names of the three men remain attached to the place. And the story continues not because every wild theory is possible, but because the plain facts still leave one narrow door open. Through that door comes the final unease of the case, and the reason people are still drawn back to the tower more than a century later. There is something strange about a lighthouse after a tragedy. It is built to be useful, steady and practical. It is not meant to be a monument to loss. It is not meant to carry a mystery in its walls. Its purpose is simple: shine at the right time, warn ships away from danger, help sailors mark their position, keep doing that work no matter what stories people tell about it. And the Flannan Isles lighthouse did keep doing that work. The men vanished, the investigation came, the reports were written, the rumours began, families grieved, newspapers found their language, later writers found their drama, and still the tower remained where it had always been, above the rocks, above the landing places, above the water that may have taken 3 keepers in a matter of moments. That may be one of the quietest and saddest parts of the whole story. The light continued, not because the loss was small, and not because anyone forgot quickly, but because the sea was still dangerous. Ships still passed those waters. The work still mattered. A lighthouse does not stop being needed because tragedy has entered it. In some ways, it becomes even more necessary. The very danger that may have taken Descartes, Marshall and MacArthur was the reason the light had been built there in the first place. The island was not a safe place, and the surrounding waters were not forgiving. So another crew had to come, another keeper had to climb the stairs, another hand had to tend the lamp, the beam had to return to the night. Imagine being one of the men who served there afterward, not arriving as a curious visitor, not stepping in for a brief look around, but living there, working there, sleeping there, eating there, and keeping watch in the same place where 3 colleagues had disappeared. Even with the most practical mind, that would settle somewhere in the body. You would know the official explanation. You might even agree with it. You might tell yourself, quite reasonably, that the men were swept away by the sea near the landing. You might know that the tower itself was sound, that the rooms were not haunted, that the lamp was only a lamp and the wind was only wind. Yet at night, when the weather pressed against the walls and the Atlantic sounded below, knowledge and feeling might not always sit in the same chair. A lighthouse keeper could not afford to be ruled by imagination. The work required steadiness. Instruments had to be checked. Records had to be made. Equipment had to be kept clean. The light had to be shown correctly. Still, human beings do not leave their thoughts outside the door. A man keeping watch after the Flannan disappearance would know that others had once moved through those rooms and then had not returned. He would know that a coat had been left behind. He would know that the light had gone dark for lack of hands to light it. He might look toward the west landing in bad weather and understand, in a direct and physical way, how quickly a practical task could become fatal. That is one thing the Flannan Isles case leaves behind: respect for ordinary danger, not fear of ghosts, not a belief that every lonely place hides something supernatural, but respect for the plain fact that nature does not become safe just because people grow familiar with it. Experience matters, but it does not make a person untouchable. Rules matter, but an urgent moment can bend them. Strong buildings matter, but the men who maintain them must sometimes step outside, and outside on an exposed Atlantic island in winter, the difference between safe and lost can be smaller than anyone would like. The story also leaves behind a lesson about evidence. It reminds us that a mystery can have a likely answer and still remain emotionally unfinished. We can say the most plausible explanation is that the 3 men were swept away by a sudden sea while attending to damage or equipment near the west landing. That fits the known facts better than murder, madness, monsters, spies, or ghosts. It explains the damaged railings, the torn-away lifebuoy, the displaced stone, the missing protective clothing, the coat left behind, the prepared lamp, the tidy kitchen, and the unlit light. It is the strongest answer. But because no one saw the final moment, because no bodies were found, and because the sea did not return what it took, the mind does not close the file as neatly as paper can. That space between probability and certainty is where many famous mysteries live. Too much is known for the wildest theories to be necessary. Too little is known for complete peace. The Flannan Isles mystery stands exactly there. We're not lost in total darkness. We have names, dates, reports, physical damage, and a reasonable conclusion. But we do not have the last scene. We do not know who first noticed the trouble. We do not know whether Ducat and Marshall went down together while MacArthur stayed behind. We do not know whether MacArthur saw them in danger and rushed out without his coat. We do not know whether the men had time to turn, shout, run, or brace themselves. We do not know whether the wave came as a single shocking wall of water, or whether a series of heavy seas trapped them one after another. The record brings us to the edge, and then the edge gives way to water. For the families, that uncertainty must have been harder than any later audience can fully understand. To listeners, the Flannan case is a story. A fascinating one, a sad one, a strange one, but still a story we can enter and leave. For the people who loved the men, it was not an evening's mystery. It was a missing husband, a missing father, a missing son, a missing colleague. It was news arriving without a body to bury. It was explanation without the comfort of witnessing. It was a future changed by an event that remained partly hidden. History often remembers the dramatic shape of a disappearance, but families live with the practical aftermath. Money, children, grief, letters, official procedures, and the long process of accepting that someone will not come home. There is a temptation, when telling old mysteries, to treat the people as if they belong more to the mystery than to their own lives. The keepers become the three vanished men, almost like a title. But they were James Ducat, Thomas Marshall, and Donald MacArthur. Ducat had spent years in Lighthouse service and held responsibility at the station. Marshall had maritime experience and served as assistant. MacArthur was there because another man was ill, filling a needed role at a difficult post. They were connected by work first and by disappearance later. Their names should not be swallowed by the legend that followed them. The lighthouse itself became a kind of container for those names. Visitors and readers think of Eilean Mor and the tower together as if the story has always belonged there. But before December 1900, the lighthouse was new and functional. It was part of a system. Afterward, it became part of a cultural memory as well. That can happen to places. A house becomes known for one family, a bridge becomes known for one collapse, a road becomes known for one accident, a lighthouse becomes known for the night its keepers vanished. The place continues doing ordinary work, but people approach it through the event. The Flannan Isles Lighthouse asks for a careful kind of attention because it sits between history and folklore. If we strip away everything imaginative, we may lose the emotional reason people still care. If we accept every legend, we lose the men and the truth. The better path is to hold the known facts firmly, then allow the atmosphere to remain as atmosphere. The island is lonely. That is true. The sea is powerful. That is true. The disappearance is unresolved in its final details. That is true. But the famous dramatic extras should stay in their proper place. They belong to the afterlife of the story, not its foundation. And perhaps the afterlife of the story tells us something about ourselves. We are drawn to places where human order meets something larger. Lighthouses are perfect examples of that. They are neat, engineered, purposeful structures set against water, weather, darkness, and distance. They make danger visible, but they cannot remove it. They reassure us, but they also remind us why reassurance is needed. When a lighthouse story goes wrong, It disturbs a very basic expectation. The keeper should be there, the light should shine, the routine should hold. At Flannan, for one winter night, and the nights that followed, it did not. That disturbance is why the case still works quietly on the imagination. It is not only the mystery of where the men went, it is the image of a system failing at its human point. The tower remained strong, the lamp was ready, the machinery was sound, the building was in order, but the men were gone. A lighthouse is not simply stone, glass, metal, oil and height. It is also the person who climbs the stairs and tends it. Without the keeper, the light is potential rather than protection. It may be built to shine, but it cannot decide to do so by itself, at least not in that older age of human-tended lights. Later, as technology changed, many lighthouses became automated. Lights that once required keepers could continue without permanent crews. For safety and efficiency, that made sense. Machines can reduce isolation, reduce risk, and keep signals working with fewer lives spent in difficult places. Yet something human was lost as well. The old lighthouse keeper belonged to a particular kind of work, patient, repetitive, skilled, and often invisible. He lived at the edge so others could pass safely. He accepted boredom, weather, and separation as part of the job. The Flannan Isles disappearance reminds us of that vanished profession, not only as romance, but as labour. There is dignity in that labour. It was not glamorous in the daily sense. It involved cleaning, recording, carrying, repairing, checking, cooking, waiting, and watching. It involved being useful in a way that might never be directly thanked. Ships passed because the light was there. Sailors trusted signals without knowing the men behind them. The keeper's success was measured partly by the absence of disaster. That is difficult work to honour, because when it goes well, it disappears into normal life. The Flannan tragedy made the keepers visible through loss, but they deserved recognition even before that. As this story settles, the most reasonable picture remains a practical one. On December 15th, the men completed much of their usual work. Something drew at least some of them outside, likely toward the west landing, where severe sea damage was later found. A powerful wave or series of waves caught them. They were swept away. The light was not lit that night. Days passed before the relief vessel could arrive. Hesperus found the island silent. Mor entered the lighthouse and saw the evidence of interrupted routine. The official investigation followed. The conclusion pointed to the sea. The sea, as it so often does, offered no statement. And maybe that is why the story feels so final and unfinished at the same time. The likely cause is known, but the men's final experience is not. We can reconstruct the path, but not the footsteps. We can name the objects, but not the last words. We can point to the landing, but not to the exact second. The lighthouse gives us rooms. The island gives us damage. The sea gives us silence. So what remains when the light keeps shining? The names remain. The work remains. The lesson remains. The tower remains. The caution remains. The unanswered details remain, though perhaps they do not need to be filled with inventions. Sometimes a respectful uncertainty is better than a false certainty. Sometimes the most honest ending to a mystery is not a grand reveal, but a careful statement of what the evidence allows and a quiet acknowledgement of what it does not. And what remains for us, listening all these years later, is the feeling of standing at a safe distance and looking toward a dangerous place. We can imagine the island without having to land there. We can hear the story without having to climb the path in December weather. We can think about the keepers from the warmth of our rooms. That distance gives us comfort, but it also gives us responsibility. We should not turn their loss into only entertainment. We can be curious, yes. We can feel the mystery, yes. But we can also remember that the centre of the story is not a ghost or a monster. It is 3 working men who did not come home. So as we leave Eilean Mor for tonight, let the image be simple. A tower on a remote island, a winter sea moving below, a light turning again through the dark after the loss. not erasing what happened, not explaining every detail, just doing what it was built to do, warning ships, marking danger, holding a steady signal where the Atlantic breaks against stone. And perhaps that is why lighthouses feel so comforting, even when their stories are sad. They do not promise that danger is gone. They do not pretend the sea is tame. They simply say, here is the edge, here is the rock, here is a signal in the dark, keep going carefully. Before you drift away from this story, think back to the small question from the beginning. Where are you listening from tonight? Are you near the sea, where a real lighthouse may still turn somewhere beyond your window? Are you far inland, where the ocean is only a thought at the edge of a map? Maybe the nearest light is not a lighthouse at all, but a bedside lamp, a hallway glow, a streetlight through curtains, or the dim screen beside you as the night grows quiet. Whatever it is, notice how even a small light can change the feeling of a room. Notice how it gives shape to the dark without needing to defeat it completely. That is enough for now. The Flannan Isles can stay where they are, far out in the Atlantic, with the wind moving over the grass and the sea continuing its patient work around the rocks. The tower remains part of history, part of mystery, and part of the long story of people trying to make dangerous waters a little safer for strangers passing in the night. If this quiet journey into history, mystery, and the edge of the sea brought you a little calm, I would be grateful if you liked the video and subscribed. It helps this small space reach others who enjoy strange true stories told gently, with room for facts, atmosphere, and rest. And if you know someone who likes lighthouse mysteries, old disappearances, or stories that leave just enough room for thought, you may share this with them too. For now, let the island fade slowly. Let the tower stand at a distance. Let the names Ducat, Marshall, and MacArthur remain with the respect they deserve. Let the legend soften, and let the most likely truth rest where the evidence places it, near the west landing, in the force of a winter sea. The light kept shining after them. Ships continued to pass. The Atlantic continued to rise and fall. And somewhere in that steady movement of water, weather, memory, and duty, the story of the Flannan Isles lighthouse remains, not solved in every detail, not lost to fantasy, but held carefully between what we know and what the sea never gave back. Sleep well, wherever you are. Keep your own small light close for a while, and when you close your eyes, may the dark feel less like an empty island and more like a quiet room, with the world outside softened, the night moving gently on, and a steady beam somewhere far away still turning across the water.